Eric Halson emerged from the white mist at the outskirts of Skeldvik an hour before dark. Slung over his shoulders were a skinny hare and a bundle of frozen fish from the ice hole. The wind blew at his back and pushed him between the snowdrifts like a stranger they wanted to shoo out the door as quickly as possible. 81 people lived in the village, and almost every one of them considered Eric a nobody, the son of a drunkard and the grandson of a madman. That's what they said about him by the well. His grandfather Ulv had lived for 30 years on the outskirts in a stone house with a hearth cut into half the wall. And until his very death, he insisted that the fire remembered more people than he did. His grandfather was buried in the fall. The house stood empty. Eric spent the night in an outbuilding by the mill and paid for a corner with animal hides. It was at the mill that the miller Gunnar met him. He looked at the skinny hare and announced loudly to the workers that the great hunter had brought the village a veritable feast. The workers laughed. Eric walked past in silence. He was used to it. People were gathering in the square by the longhouse. The village elder, Torvald, stood on a barrel and spoke of serious things. That morning, an avalanche had swept into Wolf's Mouth Gorge. The only road south to the Royal Highway had vanished under 30 cubits of snow. The messenger hadn't made it through. Skeldvik was left alone. Torvald ordered the grain and dried meat to be counted. The clerk counted aloud. It turned out that, at normal meal portions, the supplies would last 26 days. The men were silent, listening to the wind. Everyone expected the storm to run its course in 3 days, as usual, and then the men would clear a path. Eirik stood on the edge and looked up at the sky. Then he did something no one expected of him. He stepped forward and said there would be no storm in 3 days. He said the storm had come to last the entire season. He spoke calmly and cited the signs. The wind was blowing from the north and hadn't changed direction for 2 days, even though the north wind in these mountains always veers toward the sea on the second day. The snow was falling dry and fine as flour, and such snow brings only bitter cold. The birds had left the mountains a week ago, all at once, and the game in the forest had gone into such deep cover that after 3 days of hunting, he had found only one fresh track. He said that by morning the wind would shift to the east and batter the old mill's roof at an angle it was never built to withstand. He ordered that Gunnar's family be evacuated from the mill today, and that the beams of the granary be shored up. The square fell silent. Then Gunnar burst out laughing. He asked the crowd since when the son of a drunkard had been lecturing the village on the weather. Torvald frowned and said he wouldn't allow panic to spread. Erica was pushed aside. He didn't argue. He went to the mill and spent the entire evening silently hauling his hides and tools out of the outbuilding. The workers tapped their fingers against their temples. That night the wind shifted to the east. It struck the mill at exactly the angle Eric had described. The old roof creaked and caved in. A beam crashed into the room where Gunnar's youngest son was sleeping. Eric heard the crash before anyone else, because he hadn't been sleeping, he'd been waiting. He ran into the collapsing house through a hole in the wall, pulled the boy from under the bed that had slid off its frame, and carried him outside a split second before the entire roof slope collapsed. Gunnar stood in the snow in his underwear, holding his son and looking at Eirik as if he were seeing him for the first time in his life. Eirik handed the boy to him and walked off into the darkness. He had nowhere to go now except one place. His grandfather's house greeted him with a frozen silence. Hoarfrost lay on the walls like white wool. In the middle of the house stood a hearth, a huge one, built of dark stone that wasn't quarried in any of the surrounding mountains. Carved symbols ran along the stone arch. His grandfather forbade touching them with a rag and always cleaned them only with his bare hand. Eirik scooped dry kindling and birch bark from the box. His fingers barely obeyed him. He struck a spark with his grandfather's flint. The fire caught on the first try, as if it had been waiting, and the moment the flame licked the dark stone, the symbols on the arch flared with an amber light. Eirik froze. Lines appeared in the fire. Not on paper, nor on stone, but right in the flame, as if someone were writing with light upon light. He read them and felt the words enter his mind, bypassing his eyes. The hearth of the Halson clan has been awakened. The guardian has been recognized. Eric Halson, rank, Spark. There are 12 seats by the fire. The hearth's gift is active from dawn to dawn. He sat down on the floor and stared into the flames for a long time. He thought he was going mad, just like his grandfather. Then there was a knock at the door. He opened it, and Astrid, the widow, burst into the house with her son in her arms. Her hut was the last one standing by the river, and the east wind had blown out its window. The boy, Leaf, was as white as snow and barely breathing. Astrid didn't know where else to go, because no one else would have opened their door in the middle of the night for a widow with no silver. Eric sat them down by the fire. He rubbed the boy's feet and gave him boiling water mixed with the last spoonful of honey. By morning, Leaf had regained some color and fallen asleep. And at dawn, Eric saw something that made his throat go dry. A barely visible amber line hung in the air above the sleeping boy. Only he could see it. Guest of the hearth, Leaf, son of Astrid. Affinity, Scout. Gift accepted. Perception, 7. Hearing, 6. Sense of direction, 5. Time until dawn. The boy woke up and said something strange to his mother. He said he could hear water flowing in 3 places beneath the snow beyond the river, and that in the pantry, by the wall, a mouse was scratching behind the second box. Astrid moved the box aside. A mouse was sitting there. That afternoon, their neighbor Oddgear came by, an aging farmer with hands like shovels. He was the only one who hadn't laughed in the square yesterday, and now he brought Eirik a sack of turnips in gratitude for saving the boy Gunnar, because the boy was his godson. Eirik sat him down by the fire to warm up. Oddgear sat by the fire for an hour, telling how in his youth he had wanted to build ships, but instead had spent his whole life digging in the frozen earth. When he left, Eirik read a new line in the flames. Guest of the hearth, Oddgear. Affinity, Builder. Gift accepted. Keen eye, 9. Strength, 8. Sense of stone and wood, 8. Deadline, before dawn. That evening, a rumor spread through the village. Oddgeir, working alone, had erected a new retaining wall at the collapsed mill in just 4 hours. He cut the grooves without marking them out. He laid the logs so tightly that not even a knife blade could fit between them. Gunnar's workers watched in silence, and one of them dropped his axe into the snow. Oddgeir himself said, bewildered, that it was as if his hands knew what to do on their own. Eirik listened to this while standing in the darkness by a stranger's fence, and inside him, something was slowly and eerily coming together. The hearth showed people who they could become. He returned to his grandfather's house and stared at the amber symbols for a long time. Then, deep within the flames, a new line appeared, and a chill ran down his spine. The hearth keeps count. The settlement's food supply, 19 days. The survival threshold has not been met. Eirik stood and stared at the number. This morning, the count had been 26. The hearth kept track more accurately than the scribe, and the hearth already knew about the mice in the pantries and the rot in the third chest that no one had found yet. 19 days. 81 people, a whole winter ahead. There was another knock at the door. This time, it was heavy and authoritative. That's not how someone knocks for help. That's how the authorities knock. Eric placed his palm on the warm stone of the hearth and went to open the door. An avalanche had cut off Skeldvik from the kingdom, and Eirik had publicly predicted a long storm and the collapse of the mill, thereby saving the miller Gunnar's son. In his grandfather's house, he lit the ancestral hearth and activated the Hearth System, ranked Spark with 12 slots. Where Leaf received the gift of the Scout and the Plowman, Oddgeir received the gift of a Builder, Valor, salad until dawn. The hearth revealed that there was enough food in the village to last 19 days, and someone unknown was knocking insistently at the door. Standing outside the door was the village elder Thorvald, accompanied by two men carrying torches. Snow stung their faces. Thorvald entered without invitation and let his gaze sweep over the warm house and the fire in old Ulf's hearth. He said there were rumors circulating in the village. Oddgeir had accomplished in one evening what a work crew does in a week, and the widow Astrid claimed that her son could hear water beneath the snow. He said the village was cut off and frightened, and that at a time like this, the last thing it needed was witchcraft tales from a madman's house. He ordered Eirik to put out the hearth fire and not to gather people at his place. Eirik listened in silence. Then he asked the village elder about the grain count. Torvald replied that the clerk had counted enough for 26 days. Eirik said the clerk was mistaken. He said that in the third chest of the communal granary, the grain had begun to rot from the bottom due to meltwater, and that mice had gnawed tunnels behind the second chest in the 4 storerooms, and that the actual count was 19 days' worth. He proposed a simple deal. Let Torvald open the third chest in the morning in front of witnesses. If the grain was sound, Eirik himself would douse the hearth with water. If it was rotten, the village elder would give him 3 days and not interfere. Torvald looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded and walked off into the blizzard. In the morning, half the village had gathered by the granary. The clerk lifted the lid of the third chest and reached all the way to the bottom. His face turned ashen. From the bottom, he pulled out a clumped mass speckled with black spots. A murmur rippled through the crowd. They checked the storerooms. Behind the second set of crates, they found mouse tunnels exactly where Eirik had said they would be. Torvald stood over the rotten grain and remained silent for a very long time. Then he turned to Eirik and, in front of everyone, said he was giving him 3 days. Eirik didn't waste a single hour. He returned to the hearth and began to test the rules, just as one tests the ice before stepping onto it. He called people over one by one and gazed into the flames. By noon, he knew the most important thing. There were 12 seats by the fire, and the 13th guest received no gift, no matter how long he sat there. The gift lasted from dawn to dawn and faded with the first light. The hearth did not give a person what was not their own. It amplified what was already slumbering within them. The lazy remained lazy, though with strong hands. Eirik saw lines with numbers from 1 to 10 on each guest and learned to read them quickly. He also understood the cost. The hearth devoured 3 times as much firewood as usual, and on ordinary aspen, the marks faded, and the numbers of the gift dropped by 1/3. The stone burned brightest on a resinous old pine. Such pines grew only in the Black Grove beyond the frozen river, a 2-hour journey away. He'd think about that tomorrow. Today, there was something more important: the communal granary. The old log cabin had sagged at the south corner, and the rafters had arched under the weight of the snow. 2 more nights like this, and the village's entire food supply would be buried under a collapse. That evening, Eirik sat Oddgeir and his 2 longtime fellow carters by the fire, the sullen Sven and the silent Arna. They warmed themselves and talked about their youth and the ships they'd never built. In the flames, 3 notches lit up, one after another. Builder 9, Builder 7, Builder 7. That night, by the light of torches and the moon, 3 men past their prime accomplished the impossible. The village would retell the story of that night's assembly until spring. Here is Sven, cutting a groove by eye into a frozen log, and the groove fits onto the tenon without a single blow. Here is Arna, single-handedly holding on his shoulder the end of a rafter that 4 men had hoisted together earlier that day. Here is Oddgeir, walking along the roof ridge in the blizzard as if on a table, shouting down to indicate where to place a stone under a sagging corner. And now dawn breaks, and out of the blizzard emerges the barn with its straight back and new supports, and a layer of snow slides down the steep slope without pausing. The clerk stood by the barn, bareheaded, his lips moving as he counted the logs. Torvald arrived on the second day of silence. He walked all the way around the barn. He felt the grooves. He peered under the supports. Then he took off his hat and said 3 words to Eirik that no one had ever heard him say before. He said he had been wrong. By evening, there was a line of 20 people at the Halsons' house. Everyone wanted to get near the fire. Everyone was dragging something. Some a log, some a turnip, some a hide. And that was when Eirik felt for the first time how good fortune could turn into a new problem. There were 12 spots, over 30 supplicants. He chose those the village needed right now and explained why. People nodded and held a grudge. By the well, already by Caw, people were already saying that a drunkard's son was deciding who in Skeldvik would be strong and who would freeze as a commoner. Gunnar spoke the loudest. The miller never once came to the hearth. His rescued son wouldn't let him laugh openly, but envy sought a crack to slip through. Gunnar whispered by the well that it wasn't the wood that the fire took. He whispered that the fire consumed years of life and that Oddgeir's face had aged after his night on the roof. It was a lie, but a sticky one. 3 old women were already giving the Halson house a wide berth, and the firewood was running out. In 2 nights, the hearth had devoured Eirik's monthly supply and half of what had been brought in. The marks on the aspen log were fading before his eyes, and on the evening of the second day, the tally line flashed an alarming red. The hearth's fuel was running low. The power of the gift was waning. Eirik sat by the fire and counted. It was a 2-hour journey across the frozen river to the Black Grove. The ice was thin. Logs couldn't be hauled across it until the frost had frozen the river to its depths. That meant they needed a sled and a precise path through the shallow water. That meant they needed someone who could hear the water beneath the snow. He looked up. Little Leif was warming himself by the hearth in his rightful place, and 2 other boys had settled down next to him. Red-haired Kai, the tanner's son, and Ingrid, the scribe's daughter, who could run faster than any of the village dogs. The children stared at the fire, spellbound. 3 lines burned in the flames above them. Scout, scout, scout. In the morning, Eirik was going to lead them along the shore to mark the trail. He had strictly ordered them to wait for him and not to wander off anywhere. But at dawn, Astrid's scream woke him. The children's beds were empty. 3 pairs of small ski tracks led away from the village, straight toward the White River, and the blizzard was already erasing their edges. And from the direction of the river, through the howling wind, Eirik heard something that made him burst through the door without even putting on his mittens. He heard a faint cry. Eirik proved to the village elder, Thorvald, the accuracy of the hearth's location using the rotten grain he'd found, and was granted 3 days of freedom, while a trio of builders led by Oddgeir saved the communal granary overnight. The rules of the system regarding the 12 places, the gift before dawn, the intensification of inclinations, and the need for resinous pine from the Black Grove across the river. Meanwhile, the miller Gunnar was spreading rumors, and the line for the fire was breeding resentment. The 3 children of the scouts, Leif, Kai, and Ingrid, had secretly ventured out onto the river's young ice, and a scream rang out from the river. Eirik ran toward the river across the open field, sinking waist deep and scooping with his hands. The wind tore the scream to pieces and carried it along the shore, so that it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. Right at the edge of the ice, Eirik forced himself to stop, running straight across the thin ice meant drowning both himself and the children. He lay down and pressed his ear to the snow, just as his grandfather had taught him. And then he heard, not a scream of pain, he heard a cry of delight. Leif was shouting at the top of his lungs that he'd found them. The children were sitting 300 paces downstream on a mound frozen into the ice, waving their arms. Eirik crawled toward them across the wind-swept ice, ready to tear all 3 of their ears off. The words stuck in his throat. The corner of a covered wagon jutted out of the ice and snow. Ingrid was the first to notice a skid under a snowdrift. Leif heard a hollow space and a dull thud beneath the snow. Kai dug out the side of the wagon, a caravan. The autumn merchant caravan that had never made it to Skeldvik before the storm. They'd assumed it had turned south. It lay here, Eirik tapped the ice all around and ordered the children to lie down in a chain on the spread-out hides. By noon, Oddgeir and Sven arrived with 10 men carrying sleds and ropes. They worked in silence and with grim determination, for each of them understood what lay beneath the snow besides the merchandise. They found 4 wagons. They found 8 frozen bodies, among them a merchant with a southern seal on his finger. They laid them out in a row and covered them up to the springtime ground. And then, under the overturned 4th wagon in a snowdrift, they found survivors. A man in tattered chainmail held a wrapped-up girl of about 5 in his arms, and a young woman lay unconscious beside him. The man's face was blackened by the frost, and he pointed a broken sword at those who had entered. He rasped that he wouldn't give up the girl. Eirik slowly pushed the shard aside with his hand and said that they didn't take anyone here. Here, they kept people warm. The caravan guard's name was Kettle, a former soldier hired by the merchant as a bodyguard. The woman was the merchant's wife, and the girl was their daughter. When the storm overturned the wagons, Kettle kept the 3 of them alive for 9 days on horse meat and in a snow cave. Goods were being brought into the village on 6 sleds, and the clerk wrote the inventory with trembling fingers. 20 sacks of southern grain, 8 wheels of wax, salt, strips of iron, a bale of cloth, a small barrel of oil. That evening, by the light of the hearth, the village's tally rose for the first time. The settlement's food supply stood at 31 days. Eirik looked at the line and knew the truth. There were 3 more mouths to feed, and winter hadn't grown any shorter. That very night, he sat old Sigrun by the fire, an old midwife with withered hands who remembered funeral songs in a language no one else knew. She warmed herself and hummed to herself. The line above her flashed brighter than anything he'd ever seen. Guest of the hearth, Sigrun, wise disposition, gift accepted, clan memory 10, runes of protection 9, a gaze beyond the blizzard 6. Sigrun fell silent halfway through the song. She looked at her hands, then at the fire, then at Eirik. She said quietly that she had remembered. She said that her grandmother's grandmother had drawn symbols on the lintels to ward off the bitter cold, and that now she could see those symbols before her eyes as if they were embroidered. Before dawn, Sigrun went around to 8 houses with a bucket of soot mixed with mutton fat and drew a woven symbol on the lintel of each one. Gunnar by the well called it an old woman's folly. He spoke too hastily. The wolves came on the 3rd night. They were drawn by the scent of horse meat from the excavation. A pack of 16 gaunt and vicious wolves came down the riverbed and charged at full speed into the courtyards. Right before the watchman's eyes, the lead wolf slammed into the air in front of Sigrun's barn, as if into a wall, and whimpering, tumbled into the snow. The markers held the beasts at bay. The pack darted between the houses, searching for a yard without a marker. There was such a yard, the mill. The wolves encircled Gunnar's barn in a semicircle, and the lead wolf was already tearing a plank from the wall when a horn sounded low and menacing over the village. Eirik managed to line up his men behind the woodpile. The 4 hunters who had been warming themselves by the hearth the night before fired their bows as none of them had ever fired in their entire lives. The line of 8 archers did not miss. 5 wolves fell within the first half-dozen heartbeats. Oddgeir and the builders had erected a platform in the square the evening before, and now torches were flying from the platform, cutting off the pack's retreat to the river. Ketil stood in the breach of the barn with an axe, and, as thin as death, the soldier single-handedly held the gap until the men arrived. By dawn, it was all over. 11 wolf carcasses lay in the snow, meat and hides. None of the men had died. Sigrun stitched up the worker whose shoulder had been torn open, and by noon the man was joking again. Gunnar stood in the middle of his ravaged yard. He looked at the undamaged barn, at the wolf shot mid-leap 3 steps from his front door, and at the people who had come in the night to save his property after everything he'd said by the well. Then he walked across the entire square toward Eirik. The village fell silent. Gunnar stopped and spoke loudly so that everyone could hear. He said he had been a bad neighbor, and that from that day on, the mill, with all its millstones, would grind for the common pot. And that evening he sat by the hearth for the first time. The line above him made Eirik smile. A knack for mechanics, a steady hand, 9 out of 10. Gunnar had taken apart and reassembled the mill's drive mechanism by midnight, and declared that it would now produce a third more flour from the same wind. The village breathed a sigh of relief, and for the first time in many days, Skjeldvik smelled of boiled wolf meat, and almost peace. The peace lasted just one scene and no longer. Eirik himself put an end to it because he couldn't bring himself to lie. He laid out on the table before Torvald and Kettle the things that had been keeping him awake. First, the wolves weren't out hunting. The wolves were fleeing. The pack was breaking into people's homes, something a beast does only when what lies behind is more terrifying than what lies ahead. Second, Chettle had said that the day before the caravan's destruction, their drivers had seen tall figures on the crest of the pass, standing still, white, neither human nor beast. The merchant had laughed at the drivers at the time. The third and final account came from Ingrid, whom Eirik had posted as a lookout on the barn during that night of the wolves. The girl, with the keen eyesight of a scout, said calmly, and that very calmness sent a chill down the adult's spines. She said that while the torches were burning, she had been looking across the river toward the edge of the Black Grove, and at the edge, between the trunks, stood 3 tall white figures. They weren't heading toward the village. They were simply standing there, watching the fire. Meanwhile, the firewood was running out, and the path behind the resinous pine led straight there, into the Black Grove. The child scouts found a merchant caravan frozen in place, with supplies that extended their food rations to 31 days. Along with the surviving soldiers, Kettle, the merchant's wife, and his daughter. Old Sigrun received the gift of wisdom and her protective runes, along with the strengthened hunters, builders, and Kettle, repelled a nighttime attack by 16 wolves. Afterward, the miller Gunnar publicly repented, sat down by the hearth, and became a mechanic. It turned out that the wolves had been fleeing from the tall, white figures they had seen at the pass and on the edge of the Black Grove, where the villagers would inevitably have to go to gather resinous pine for the fading hearth. In the morning, Eirik convened a council in the longhouse and spoke briefly. The hearth is growing weak on poor firewood, and without resinous pine, in 4 days the offerings will be cut in half, and in 7 they will die out entirely. To find the resinous pine, we must go to the grove where the white figures stand. This means we must go in such a way that we can return. Chettle listened with his arms crossed and made no secret of what he was thinking. He said outright that he had seen the peasant militias and had seen what was left of them. He said that whether the fire was a miracle or not, a plowman wouldn't become a soldier in 3 days, and that if the whites came in earnest, neither runes nor ramparts would save the village. He proposed something else, to lead everyone south to dig a passage through the avalanche while there was still food. Torvald objected that old people and children would perish on the pass in a winter like this. They argued until they were hoarse. Eirik ended the argument simply. He suggested that Kettle wait 3 nights and then decide. If, after 3 nights, Kettle said to leave, the village would vote honestly. Kettle smiled and agreed because he was certain he was right. For the next 3 nights, Skjeldvik didn't sleep, and those 3 nights were later remembered as if they were one. Here is the first night. 9 builders, ranging in age from 7 to 9, are cutting snow into bricks as tall as a man, while Gunnar, with his gift for mechanics, sets the gate on runners with a basket attached, and the bricks float upward on their own. Here is the second night. Around the inhabited center of the village, a rampart of snow and ice is closing in, 1.5 times a man's height, doused with water and frozen solid in the bitter cold. Here comes Sigrun and 2 other old women, who received the gift of wisdom by the fire. They walk along the rampart and weave black, braided symbols into the ice every 10 steps. Now it is the third night, and a watchtower with a brazier rises above the gate, while Ingrid, from the tower amid the swirling snow, reads aloud the markings on the sacks stacked 200 paces away. All this time, Ketil walked in silence, probing the ice of the rampart with his fingernail, watching as the aging Sven single-handedly erected the gate frame that it would take 6 men to set up in the garrison. On the third morning, he went to see Eirik. He placed the shard of his sword on the table and said that he had made 2 mistakes in his life. The first was when he hired himself out to the merchant. The second time was 3 days ago. He said he had never seen walls of such purity, not even in a baron's fortress, and that if the keeper would take him to the fire, he wanted to know who the hearth considered him to be. That night, a line lit up above the former soldier, and Eirik couldn't take his eyes off it for a long time. Affinity, commander, formation, 10, battle eye, 9, composure, 9. Ketil misread the astonishment on Eirik's face and tensed up. Eirik had spoken only the numbers aloud to him. The next morning, Ketil gathered everything that could hold a spear, and the rampart ceased to be merely a rampart. It became a fortress with calculations, shifts, and horn signals. Now they could march behind the pine tree. Eirik took 14 men, 6 builders with axes, 4 of Ketil's archers with bows, 2 of Leif's sledders with his ear for water, and Sigrun, who insisted on going herself because her signs wouldn't reach across the river without her touch. Leif charted the path through the shallows without a single mistake. The grove greeted them with a silence so thick it rang in their ears. Old pines, 3 arm spans in circumference, stood black with resin. They worked quickly and silently. They felled only dead wood, as Sigrun had ordered, because no living tree in this grove was to be cut down. They loaded the sleds in 3 hours, and as they were harnessing the last team, Leif suddenly pulled off his hat and said that the snow sounded wrong. The snow creaked of its own accord. There was no wind. They emerged from behind the tree trunks as silently as frost forming on glass. 4 of them, twice the height of a man, as if fashioned from blue ice and packed snow, with slits for eyes in which a whitish void burned. Sigrun managed to shout a single word: "Circle!" The people huddled inside the furrow she had traced in the snow, and the furrow flared with frost. The first white figure struck the circle, and his arm was blown to icy dust. The second moved along the furrow, searching for a gap. The arrows of the Ketil archers struck them and got stuck, to no avail. Eirik did the only thing that came to mind. He snatched a pot of coals from the family hearth, which he'd taken from the sled to warm Sigrun's hands, and hurled it at the nearest figure. The pot burst. The coals spattered like amber. The white figure was gone. It hadn't split apart or fallen over. It had simply ceased to exist, as if a flame had licked the pattern off the snow. The remaining 3 froze. Then, all at once, they retreated behind the tree trunks and vanished into the snow. They retreated without looking back, driving the sled so fast that the runners sang. Back home, Eirik sat late into the night, poring over what he'd found the previous week in a hiding place beneath the hearth, and which he now read with fresh eyes. His grandfather's notebook, bound in tarred leather. Olv's handwriting was scrawled but clear. Hearths stood in a chain across the entire north, 1 per valley. The guardians kept the warmth, and the cold did not dare descend from the glaciers. Then the guardians began to die, one after another, and the young people left for the south, and the hearths went out. Grandfather wrote that the cold is not a storm. Grandfather wrote that the cold grazes. It extinguishes the warm spots, just as a shepherd stokes the embers, and its servants roam where the hearth has grown weak. The last entry was made a month before Grandfather's death, and it sent a chill through Eric. Grandfather wrote that in the entire chain he could now hear only two living hearths, his own and another far to the north, which calls and calls. At dawn, Ingrid sounded the horn from the watchtower. Eric flew up the stairs. The girl silently pointed beyond the rampart. Along the edge of the distant shore, white figures were moving in the gray light. They walked in a chain at equal distances from one another, like herders. Ingrid counted aloud in an even voice. She counted to 43 and said that wasn't all. Over the course of 3 nights, the builders, bolstered by the hearth, along with the mechanic Gunnar and the wise ones, had erected an icy fortress with runes around the village, thereby convincing the skeptic Kettle, who sat by the fire and received the commander's gift of the 10 formation. The expedition to the Black Grove yielded a supply of resinous pine, but the party was attacked by icy figures that were impervious to arrows, but could be destroyed by Sigrun's runes, and, especially, by the coals from the ancestral hearth. From his grandfather's notebook, it became known that the chain of northern hearths had gone out, that the cold deliberately extinguishes warmth, and that there is a second living hearth far to the north. Meanwhile, a chain of more than 43 white figures appeared near the village. Eirik climbed down from the watchtower and did not allow himself a single unnecessary sigh. He gathered the council right at the gate in the freezing cold because there was no time to go to the longhouse. Ingrid reported from the watchtower that the white figures had formed a ring on the far shore and were standing motionless. Shettle said that this wasn't how bandits stood. It was a siege. A siege waits until the besieged run out of what makes them strong. Eirik finished his thought for him. The white men are waiting for the fire to die down. So there's only one answer. The fire must not die down. It must reach the walls. The village spent the entire day preparing, and that day was filled with work that every participant would remember until their old age. Here is Gunnar, with 2 apprentices, forging lattice baskets from iron strips carried by caravans to mount on posts. Into these baskets they place coals from the ancestral hearth, transported in clay pots. Here are the builders erecting these posts along the rampart every 20 paces, and the rampart begins to glow with a chain of amber dots like a necklace. Here is Sigrun, with 2 wise men, renewing the woven symbols. Now she draws them not with soot, but with soot mixed with oil and crushed charcoal from the hearth, and the symbols under her hands do not turn black, but glow with warm gold. Here is Chettle driving 3 shifts of spearmen along the rampart until the plowmen begin to turn to his horn faster than they expect. And here is Eric, sitting right by the hearth, reading in the flames the line that the hearth ignited when the first resinous pine was brought into the house. The hearth is reinforced. Rank, coal. There are 16 seats by the fire. The keeper has been granted the minor transfer of flame. The minor transfer signified something simple yet immense. The hearth fire, carried by the keeper's hand, did not go out in the frost nor in the wind. The whites arrived during the 3rd night watch when the moon had set behind the ridge. They did not roar or run. They crossed the river in silence, all in a single chain, and the ice responded to their footsteps with a long, glassy moan. Ingrid counted from the watchtower, her voice unshaken. 51. The first ones reached the rampart and struck. Where Sigrun's signs smoldered, icy fists shattered into dust. But the whites did not retreat as they had in the grove. They took turns and struck the same spot, just as water strikes a stone. The eastern symbol dimmed from the 3rd blow. Then it went out. 3 of them moved into the breach at once, and then Gunnar's necklace sprang into action. Ketty's arrows did not strike the white ones. On command, they struck the baskets above the breach and knocked them down. Embers from the ancestral hearth rained down on their icy shoulders, and the white ones vanished like frost melting on the side of a stove. The wall held twice. The third time, it did not. Right at the gates, 4 figures simultaneously brought down a corner and entered. And Sven, the spearman closest to them, instead of fleeing, did what Ketil had drilled into him. He took a step back, closed ranks with his neighbors, and the formation of 6 plowmen, with a total of 10 men above their commander, met the ice with spearheads smeared with hearth soot. As the enemy poured in, clad in white, and the white figures shuddered and slowly sank to the ground. But there were many of them, and they kept coming, and Eirik realized that the odds were not in the village's favor. And then he did what he had been saving his strength for all day. He removed the main brazier from the hearth. The open flame of the ancestral fire settled on his hands with a warm heaviness and did not go out in the wind, just as the verse had promised. Eirik climbed onto a broken corner of the rampart, with the brazier held high above his head, and walked along the edge straight toward the white ones. He walked, and the fire walked with him. The figures closest to him recoiled. For the first time all night, they recoiled. The flame roared in the wind, and in its light, Eirik saw something that nearly made him stumble. The white ones weren't afraid of pain, because they felt no pain. They were afraid of the light. They shielded their eyes from it with their hands, just as people do. Ketil saw this from the wall, and the horn sounded the general charge. The village surged forward behind the fire, spears in formation. Embers from the baskets fanned out. Sigrun's signs flared up all along the rampart at once, when the old woman struck the gate stone with her staff and cried out a word from a funeral song. By the time the gray dawn broke, not a single standing figure remained on the snow before the rampart. Only melted ice mounds, slowly losing their shape. Skjaldvik stood. None of the people had perished. Sigrun and the elders had nursed the frostbitten and battered back to their feet within a day. That evening, the village ate a hot meal around communal fires, and Torvald announced before everyone that from that day forward, Skjaldvik would have 2 chieftains, for the law of the day was his, and the law of winter was Eirik's. The people clattered their spoons against their bowls, and it was the greatest honor Eirik had ever received in his life. He smiled and said nothing about what he had seen at dawn, and this is what he had seen. The last of the white figures, as it settled, did not crumble away immediately. On its smooth, icy chest, for a single heartbeat, a reflection appeared that could not have been there. A human face, an old one, with closed eyes, and the lips of that face moved as if counting. Eirik told only Sigrun and Ketil about this. Sigrun was silent for a long time, then said that there can be no servants without a master, and that the master now knows where the fire burns and who tends it. That night, Eirik sat alone by the hearth. Rang coal warmed the house evenly and strongly, and 16 seats awaited tomorrow's guests. He had almost dozed off when the flame flickered without a draft. The symbols on the stone arch flashed not with amber, but with a cold blue light, and a line formed of its own accord in the fire, one he had not summoned. The hearth of the Halsen chain hears the hearth of the Vorn chain. North. Distance. 9 days' journey. Message received. The line flickered and unfolded into words that took Eirik's breath away. To the keeper of the southern fire, if you are alive, answer. Our hearth is dying out. The cold has taken hold of the valley and is moving south along the chain. It's extinguishing us last. Yours is next. We have 12 days worth of fuel left. We have 40 children with us. Eirik sat motionless, watching as deep within the flames behind the blue letters, a map of mountain valleys with 2 burning dots slowly emerged. His point was bright. The northern one was fading before his eyes. Between them lay 9 days of winter travel and all the cold of the world. He reached out toward the warm stone and realized that the decision had already been made and that it would once again give rise to a problem greater than any before. Fire does not leave fire behind. In a single day, the village had prepared its defenses with baskets of coals from the ancestral hearth, reinforced by runes forged by Gunnar, strengthened by Sigrun, and arranged according to Kettle's formation. And the hearth had grown to the rank of a 16-seat coal hearth, granting the keeper a small portion of an unquenchable flame. A nighttime assault by 51 icy figures was repelled without loss. Moreover, it turned out that the White Ones fear the light of the ancestral fire, and in the last figure, Eirik saw the reflection of an old human face whose lips were counting. The hearth received a message from the dying northern hearth of the Vorn clan, 9 days' journey away, where there were 40 children and fuel for 12 days, and the cold was spreading southward in a chain, with Eirik's hearth named as the next target. In the morning, Eirik laid his grandfather's notebook and the blue message before the council and told them everything as it was. In the north, 9 days' journey away, the last hearth in the chain, except for their own, is dying out. There are 40 children and enough fuel for 12 days. The cold is extinguishing the hearths one by one, and after the northern one, it will come here. He said he would go there, and that this was not an act of kindness, but a calculated move. As long as 2 fires are burning, the cold divides its strength. When only one remains, the full weight of the world's winter will come crashing down on Skeldvik all at once. The council's silence did not last long. The first to stand up was the hunter Bjorn the Elder, one of those who had gone with Eirik behind the pine tree. He was one of the new guests at the hearth, and could now shoot so well that he could bring down a partridge in a blizzard. He said that the journey would take 9 days there and 9 back, and that no one in their right mind would haul a fire across mountains teeming with white. He said that the village had only just managed to fend off the attack by a miracle, and that taking the guardian away would be like ripping the heart out of the fortress. 3 others supported him. And then the woman spoke, the one from whom no one had expected a word, the wife of the late merchant Ragna, who had been bedridden with a fever for a week and had only gotten up yesterday. She stepped into the center of the room, thin and upright, and said that the snow had taken her husband and 8 workers just 1 day's journey from the warmth. She said she knew the cost of a 9-day winter journey better than anyone in that house, and that if the guardian were to go, he must travel not as merchants do, but as those who carry fire. She said that half of her caravan's goods lay in the granary, and that she would give it all away. A sleigh with a double bottom, 8 circles of wax to waterproof the canopy, salt and butter. And then she said something that made Bjorn lower his eyes. She said that a stranger's soldier had dug her little girl out from under the snow and warmed her by a stranger's fire, and that since then, the word stranger has had no place in her mouth. The council deliberated until noon and reached this decision. Eirik will go with a small detachment. Kettle and Torvald will hold the village. Astrid and Sigrun will tend and clean the hearth for the duration of the campaign, because the hearth has recognized them as permanent guests and has not gone out in their care. In the evening, Eirik checked the last and most important thing by the fire. The line of the small oracle unfolded and revealed something new. The keeper has the right to separate the child of the flame. The child lives in a sealed brazier for 12 days. The child bestows a gift upon the 3 sitting nearby. If the child goes out far from the hearth, the keeper grows weak. Eirik stared at the last phrase for a long time and did not read it aloud to anyone. He chose his people as one chooses stones for a masonry wall. Oddgeir and Sven, because the road through the mountains is a road through rubble, and it cannot be traversed without builders. Bjorn and the young archer Hrodgeir, because Bjorn came on his own after the council and silently placed his bow on the table, and the hearth loves it when a skeptic stands guard. Sigrun, because without her trail markers, overnight stops in the snow would become death traps. Kai, because of the 3 children of the scouts, he's the strongest on skis. And after 10 nights by the fire, his hearing has improved to an 8. And Ketil gave him his best spearman, Svein, the brother of that Sven who kept order at the gate, to take on the expedition. 7 men and the guardian, 2 sleds. The child of flame in the double-walled brazier forged by Gunnar. In a single day, Gunnar reinforced the runners and fitted the sled with pulleys so that 2 men could pull the load where 6 would normally be needed. Sigrun embroidered the symbols of the hearth's ashes onto the canopy. Ragna packed the provisions so skillfully that the scribe, looking at the inventory, said it was the first time he'd seen the mathematics of love. They set out before dawn. The entire village stood silently along the rampart because words would have been less effective than action. Ingrid sounded the way for them from the watchtower, just as one sounds the way for warriors. The first 2 days were spent setting up camp, which Eirik later recalled as one long breath. Here the party is walking along the bed of a frozen stream, and Kai is leading them between the wormwood bushes, hearing the water through the ice. Here is the saddle pass, where the wind has blown the snow down to the rock, and the builders carve steps into the ice in 3 hours, along which the sleds pass, where caravans perished. Here is the first overnight stay in a snow cave, and Sigrun draws a circle with a charcoal brazier in the center, and the 3 sitting closest to it receive their lines. The warmth of blood, resistance to the cold, a steady stride. In the morning, these 3 are the first to pull the sled, and they take turns by the fire just as rowers do. Here, on the 3rd day, Bjorn shoots down a white owl on the fly and stares for a long time at the arrow in his hand, then at the brazier, and says nothing. But in the evening, for the first time, he himself asks for a place by the fire. On the 4th day, they saw a dead village. It lay in a side valley, a cluster of gray, smokeless boxes. The gates stood wide open, and the snow in the courtyards lay untouched. Eirik led the party inside because his grandfather's notebook had named this valley. This was the hearth of the Skeggi clan. They found it in the longhouse, a large hearth made of the same dark stone as Eirik's house, split open. Not just cooled, but split by a clean crack running from top to bottom, as if struck by an ice wedge. People lay in a semicircle around the hearth, frozen in their seats, faces turned toward the stone, just as those who had been warming themselves until the very end would sit. Sigrun walked around them and said quietly that there was no death in their faces, only sleep. Kai, standing by the door, suddenly called out to Eirik in a hoarse whisper. On the inside of the gate, someone had scratched deep furrows into the frost, and the cold had preserved them. These were not symbols. These were words. He comes when the fire is left alone. Do not trust the old man with closed eyes. Eirik read them 3 times. The old man with closed eyes. The face from the icy chest of the last white figure rose before him as if alive. He ordered no one to touch anything and to take the sleigh away. And as the party was leaving the dead gate, Hrodgir, who was bringing up the rear, called out to everyone and pointed back toward the ridge of the valley. Against the backdrop of the gray sky, a single white figure stood on the ridge. She was not hiding. It raised its hand and slowly waved it after the departing sled, like an escort showing guests the way, or like a shepherd counting his flock. From the Valley of the Dead, the road led upward and northward, and with each passing day, the world around them grew quieter and whiter. On the 5th day, even the crows fell silent. On the 6th, Kai said he could no longer hear the water beneath the ice because it had frozen all the way to the bottom, something that never happens, not even in the harshest winters. They now built their overnight shelters like small fortresses. The builders could carve out a snow house in an hour. Sigrun closed the circle. The brazier was placed in the center, and every evening Eirik opened the damper and gazed at the child of flame. The flame burned steadily, but on the 6th night, Eirik noticed for the first time that the amber in it had grown paler. A line deep within confirmed the cold. The child of flame. 6 days remained. The whites had been following them the whole way. They didn't attack. Hrodgir counted them each morning on the ridges. 3, 5, 8. They always stood behind and to the sides, never ahead. And Bjorn was the first to say aloud what everyone was thinking. They aren't being pursued, they're being driven. Like a beast being driven to the hunt. Svein the spearman suggested turning back and engaging them while their numbers were still small. Eirik forbade it. Every pot of coals and every hour of daylight was more precious than 11 icy statues. On the 7th day, the mountains parted, and the party emerged at the edge of a vast basin. Below lay the Valley of the Horns, and at the sight of what they saw, Svein cursed at length while Sigrun gripped her staff tightly. The valley had been half devoured. Eirik could not describe it any other way. From the north, a glacier, which had no business being there, was creeping into it like a tongue. The ice covered the forest, and the tops of the pine trees jutted out from its edge like grass poking out from under a boot. Where the ice had not yet reached, abandoned farmsteads stood, already grayed by frost. And at the far end of the valley, on a hill above the frozen lake, a single warm spot glowed. Smoke. A straight column of smoke rose above a large house behind a log fence. It was a half-day's journey across the valley to reach it, and the entire route was as clear as day from the glacier. They descended along the riverbed in dead silence, and halfway down the valley, the silence ended. The ice of the lake to their left groaned and bucked, and figures began to rise from beneath it. Not 4 and not 10. Ingrid wasn't there to count, but Eirik counted to 20 and stopped. The white figures rose between the party and the hill, cutting off the path to the smoke. Behind them, the 8 who had been following descended from the ridge. The trap had snapped shut. Bjorn shouted that he saw a gap to the right along the boulders on the shore. Eirik's heart skipped a beat. The gap was too convenient. That's how you leave the gate in a corral. He led the detachment not toward the gap, but straight ahead, head on into the thickest part of the chain. Because behind that chain stood granite cliffs rooted in the shore, and his grandfather's notebook said that the servants of the cold do not like living stone. What followed was a battle that each of the 7 later recounted in their own way, while Eirik remembered it in fragments. Here is Sigrun, with her sled in motion, striking the snow with her staff, and from the blow as a smoldering furrow, and the white figures in front of the sleds recoil from its path. Here, Oddgeir and Sven turn the front sleds sideways, and the wall of the double bottom, studded with iron spikes hammered in by Gunnar and blackened by hearth soot, takes the first blow, and the icy hand shatters against the spikes. Here, Bjorn and Hrodgeir, standing back to back, set alight arrows lit from the brazier, and the arrows, with a spark of flame on their tips, do what ordinary men could not. The white ones burst from them just as ice burdens on a spring river. Here, Svein uses his spear to knock down the figure leaning against the rear of the second sleigh, and yells at Kaya to hold the canopy because the brazier is inside it. And here comes the most terrifying part. The figure, a head taller than the rest, bursts through the boulders from the side where they weren't expecting it, and its fist comes down from above, straight toward the wrought iron box containing the child of flame. Eirik reacts in time, because the entire battle has been taking place within 3 paces of the brazier. He blocks the blow, not with steel, but with his open shield. The child's light strikes the figure through the slits of its eyes. The white giant freezes mid-swing, and for a moment, that very old face, with closed eyes, appears on his smooth chest, its lips moving quickly and maliciously. And then Sigrun drives the staff, its tip heated in the brazier, into the giant's back with both hands, and the giant collapses into a heap of wet snow. They'd broken through. They'd lost 1 sled and half their supplies. Svein's left shoulder had been crushed by an icy fist, and Sigrun was setting it on the run. Hrodgeir was limping. But the brazier was still burning, and there were 300 paces left to the fence, and from the fence they had already been spotted. The gate opened before they reached it. Dozens of hands pulled them inside, and the gate slammed shut behind them, and a long, disappointed groan of ice echoed across the valley beyond the fence. Eirik stood hunched over, catching his breath, and only then looked up. The people of Vorn stood all around him, exhausted, gray, and almost all of them a head shorter than him, because almost all of them were children. Children held spears made of poles. Children stood guard on the palisade. Eirik counted barely a dozen adults, and half of them were old men. And then the crowd parted, and the keeper of the northern hearth stepped forward. Eirik had been expecting an old man with a staff. Standing before him was a girl barely older than himself. Dark hair with a white strand at her temple, a cloak scorched at the hem. The eyes of someone who hadn't slept in a week. She looked at the brazier in his hands, and at the amber glow on the snow, and her chin trembled, but her voice did not waver. She said her name was Idis of the Vorn clan, and that she no longer believed. And from behind her, a tall, old man with a face as dark as bark was watching the newcomers. He was the only sturdy old man among the children. He wasn't looking at Eirik. He was looking at the brazier, without taking his eyes off it, and his eyes were almost closed, as if shielding them from a bright light. Eirik remembered the words scratched into the gate of the dead village, and slowly placed the brazier behind his back. The Vorn house greeted Eirik with the smell of thin soup and the sound of children coughing from every corner. The Vorn family hearth stood in the middle of the longhouse and was 1.5 times larger than his grandfather's, but it burned only at half strength. The symbols on its arch glowed every other one. Idis told her story briefly and without self-pity. Her father, the keeper, had perished that fall on the glacier while searching for the cause of the cold. The hearth had acknowledged her, but her rank had fallen from flame to ember because the keeper was young and the clan was small. The cold had devoured 3 farmsteads in a month, along with everyone who hadn't made it behind the fence. The adult men had been wiped out on 2 forays for firewood. 11 adults and 40 children remained, with enough fuel for 10 days, because the message had taken 2 days to reach Eirik. Eirik listened and looked at the old man with the dark face. The man sat in the far corner, mending a net. Idis caught his eye and said that this was Grim, the newcomer. They'd found him on the frozen lake a week before her father's death, freezing, with no memory of who he was. He's quiet and helpful, and the children love him because he carves toys for them. Eirik asked flatly if Grim was sitting by the hearth. Idis replied that Grim was the only one who refused. He says the heat is bad for his old bones. Eirik said nothing. To accuse the helpful old man based on words scratched into the gate of a dead village would mean tearing apart a home that was hanging by a thread. But that very night he did 2 things. He asked Sigrun to draw a small circle around the sleeping area where the brazier stood. And he told Idis about the dead village of Skeggi, everything except the words on the gate. In the morning, the countdown began, and Eirik led him as Kettle would have. The first fuel. 1/2 paces beyond the fence stood a fine pine grove, but every foray cost blood. Eirik seated Vornas, his builders, Bjorn, and 3 of Idis's strong teenagers by the hearth. The northern hearth welcomed the strangers reluctantly, and yielded only half the expected amount, but even that was enough. In 2 short forays, under cover of flaming arrows and Sigrun's fire line, they felled and hauled 16 logs inside. Second meal. Kai, with his keen hearing, found a fishing hole under the lake ice near the shore, where the fish were packed as tightly as firewood in a woodpile. And the children, under his command, drilled holes throughout the day and hauled in 3 barrels of silvery fish. The children laughed on the ice. Idis stood on the fence and watched the laughing children as if she were witnessing a miracle greater than fire itself. The third was the hearth itself. On the evening of the 3rd day, Eirik and Idis did what none of their ancestors had done, because their ancestors hadn't had time. They placed a brazier containing the seed of the southern flame at the mouth of the northern hearth. The flames flared up in both fires at once. The Vorn hearth accepted the kinship. Its rank was restored to full embers. There were 14 seats by the fire. The shared flame was opened to the guardians. The fire rose in the hearth as an even wall, and for the first time in a month, a dry, strong warmth spread through the longhouse. The children slept that night without coughing, and Eirik and Idis sat by the shared flame until morning, comparing their grandfather's notebook with the Vorn family book, and what emerged from the two books was greater than both of them. The chain of hearth did not warm the villages. The villages served as its sentinels. The chain kept the glacier in the heart of the north locked away, and within the glacier slept that which the Voron books called the forefather of frost, and which Eirik's grandfather called the shepherd. The first hearth of the chain stood directly on the glacier in an ancient sanctuary, and its keeper, named Vorulf, had remained there alone 200 years ago when his line died out from the plague. The Book of the Vorns cut short the story of him with a single line. The keeper of the first fire is neither dead nor alive. The frost speaks through his mouth. Idis looked up at Eirik and whispered that her father had gone to the sanctuary that very fall, and he never returned. On the 5th day, the house was almost alive. On the 6th, everything fell apart. It didn't fall apart from the outside, but from the inside. At night, a girl screamed by the far wall. Eirik was the first to reach her. The small circle Sigrun had drawn around the brazier had been broken. Someone had carefully smoothed over the groove with the sole of their shoe in one spot. The brazier's flap stood wide open, and the flame inside flickered feebly, pale as someone had stuffed the brazier to the brim with damp bark, which was smothering the fire with smoke. Eirik scooped out the bark with his bare hands, and the flame came back to life. Then he turned and saw what the entire awakened house had seen. A mitten lay on the floor by the brazier, a large one, with the same pattern Grim used to tie his own. The house buzzed with commotion. The teenagers grabbed the old man and dragged him toward the fire, and Grim didn't struggle, but only repeated that he'd lost the mitten yesterday and hadn't gone near the brazier. Someone was already shouting about the ice and the master. Svein placed his hand on his knife, and then Eirik did something no one expected, not even he himself a moment before. He raised his hand and ordered everyone to be quiet. Then he took the mitten and held it up to the mouth of the hearth. The collective flame was now his flame, and he asked the fire as the kinship verse had taught him. The fire answered. An amber glow, even and pure, ran along the mitten. And then Eirik slowly moved his hand along the circle of people standing around him, and above one head, the hearth's glow flickered and went out, just as a candle goes out under wet fingers. It was not Grim's head. It was the head of a quiet, freckled man named Snorri, one of the last remaining adults among the Vorns. The one who, 3 weeks ago, was the only one to return alive from the second foray for firewood, in which 5 had perished. Snorri met Eirik's gaze and didn't wait. He overturned the bench onto the teenagers and darted not toward the door, but toward the hearth. In his raised hand was a wedge of black ice, the very kind used to split living stone. The rest was decided in the blink of an eye. Bjorn, standing by the wall, took him down with a shot to the shoulder, and Snorri spun around and fell, the wedge pointing downward. The wedge did not sink into the hearth, but into the floorboard, and the floorboard beneath him turned black with frost, a full elbow's width around it. Snorri was subdued. He did not scream or make excuses. He sat on the floor and smiled, and steam rose from his mouth, even though the house was warm. Then he lifted his face and spoke, and the voice was his, but the words were not his own. Slow, ancient. The voice said that warmth always betrays from within, because the living always needs something. Snorri needed the cold to give him back his brothers, who had frozen to death on the foray. The voice said that now there were 2 fires in one house in the valley, and that it was convenient. No need to put them out twice. The voice said that he was already on his way, and that he thanked the Southern Guardian for bringing the child of flame so far from home, because back home, by the southern fire, there was so little protection left. Snorri dropped his head and went limp, and a small shard of black ice oozed from his mouth and melted on the warm floor. And outside, above the valley, the glacier screamed. There was no other way to describe the sound. A long, screeching cry from a mass that had begun to move. Hrodgir slid down from the fence into the house and reported in a pale voice. The edge of the glacier had begun to move. Light was descending along it from the sanctuary down into the valley, cold, blue. And it did not move as a man moves. It moved as a master moves. Eric climbed onto the fence and watched the blue light for just long enough to gauge its speed. The light crept slowly. Across open ground through the devoured forest, it would take the master a day, perhaps a day and a half, to reach the fence. Eric climbed down and gathered everyone who could make a decision into a circle around the communal fire. Idis, Sigrun, Oddgeir, Bjorn, and Grim, whom he himself had led by the hand into the circle because the household owed the old man a debt. The choice was simple and terrifying: to stay behind the fence and receive the master here, or to head south with the entire household and 40 children to face the winter. Bjorn said that it would take 9 days to cross the mountains with the children, and that the wattle fence was at least some kind of wall. Sigrun replied that against the one who had shattered Skeggie's hearth, the fence was no wall, but mere brushwood. Ida silent, gazing into the fire, and then she spoke a word that turned everything around. She said that the Vorn hearth was no longer bound to the stone. That night, after the fires had merged, a line appeared in her flame that she did not understand then, but now understands. A kindred hearth can be carried away by a keeper if a second keeper holds the ancestral flame. The fire can be led away, not abandoned, but led away, just as livestock is led away from a doomed pasture. And then the master here will have nothing to extinguish, and the 2 fires will stand behind a single wall, where the wall is real. Skeldvik's ice fortress, Kettle, the necklace of coals. The decision was made before morning, and the morning began with an assembly that Eirik remembered as the most desperate labor of his life. Here, Gunnar's wheels from the surviving sled are being mounted onto the Vorn's large sled, and the builders, along with the northern youths, are harnessing a train of 6 wagons. Here is Idis, a knife in his hand and his face pale, extracting the heart of fire from the ancestral stone and placing it into his father's forged box. The Vorn hearth goes out, and the box begins to glow through the seams, while Idis weeps without stopping his work. Here are Sigrun and Grim, cutting 40 torches, 1 for each child, because it has been decided that every child will carry their own small fire, and the cold will not dare to break the chain of 40 fires. Here, Regnina's salt and wax are used to impregnate the canopies, while the fish from Kaya's pit are loaded into a wall of ice. By evening, the procession was ready. 40 children, 11 adult Vorns, 7 Southerners, 2 fires. And when the gates opened, Grim approached Eirik and said quietly that he would bring up the rear. He said he had recalled something from a memory he no longer had. He said his hands remembered the ice. The road back was the same, yet it was different. The herders no longer stood on the ridges. Now a blue light stretched behind the entire valley, and as it moved, the air rang like glass by nightfall. The master was in no hurry. He had nowhere to rush to. He followed the trail as winter does. They gained time during the first 2 days, because Eirik led the train not along the old road, but along the route that Kai had mapped out. After the communal bonfire, the boy's hearing had improved to a level of 10, and he guided the 6 wagons across the ice as if following a thread. On the third day, at a narrow spot near the saddle, what Eirik feared more than battle itself happened. A landslide had blocked the steps the builders had hewn along the path northward. So much snow had slid down that it was impossible to go around, and hewing new steps would take a full day, a day they didn't have. And then, those whom no one had called upon stepped forward, children. 40 children with torches formed a chain along the blockage, knee-deep in the snow, and held the flames alight while the builders, guided by the light of 40 small fires, cut a passage. Oddgeir later said that his hands worked that night as if by magic. They made it through in 9 hours. On the 5th day, the master began to play. White people began to emerge toward the train, one by one, two by two. They didn't attack the wagons. They struck at the edges. They dragged the reindeer at the rear into a crevasse. They smashed a barrel of fish. At night, they formed a ring around Sigrun's circle and stood in silence until dawn, while 40 children inside the circle sang until dawn, because Grim had said that silence was now on the side of the ice, and the voice was on the side of the fire. On the 7th day, Eirik saw the familiar figure of a giant on the ridge, and realized that the battle had begun in earnest. The White Ones advanced in waves. They fought off the attacks as they moved. Svein stood on the rear wagon with a spear, using only one hand. Bjorn fired arrows so relentlessly that by evening the skin on his fingers was cracking. Hrodgeir had taken the blow intended for Kai, and now lay on the wagon with his chest bandaged. And yet the convoy pressed on, and on the 8th day from the last pass, they saw the Skeldvik valley below. Eirik looked down, and his heart first leapt and then sank. The fortress still stood. A necklace of coals burned along the rampart, but a ring lay around the rampart, a wide, even ring of broken, heaped-up ice and snow, like water surrounding a besieged island, and the White Ones were moving slowly along the ring, many of them. Ingrid would later give the number from the watchtower. 107. The master had spoken the truth through Snorri's mouth. While the Guardian was walking north, the cold had reached his home. Kettle had held the fortress for 6 nights. The hearth was devouring the last embers of the ancestral fire, and Astrid, along with Sigrun's students, were scooping the heat out of the hearth faster than it could be produced. The fortress was living on its last embers, and between the train of 40 children and the fortress gates lay a field 1,000 paces wide and the ring of the siege. Eirik gathered everyone in the ravine below the pass. He said they would set out at dawn, when the whites were at their slowest. He said the column would form a wedge. At the front would be carts with shields and spikes. In the middle would be the children with torches and both kinds of fire. He said he himself would go first, holding an open ancestral flame in his hands, just as he had done at the rampart, because the whites recoil from the light of the Guardian. And Idis would go last, with the box of the Vorns, because the two kinds of fire must not be placed side by side in a single wedge formation. The night before the breakthrough, Grim approached him. The old man sat down beside him in the snow and spoke calmly and simply, and his words sent a chill down Eric's spine that not even a glacier could match. Grim said he had been staring at the blue light for 8 days and that his memory was returning to him in fragments. He said he remembered the sanctuary from the inside. He remembers the hearth more than the house. He remembers how, 200 years ago, he kept the first fire burning all by himself, and how, as the fire began to die out, he was afraid of dying on duty and asked the ice for a reprieve. Grim looked up at Eirik, and in the gray light of dawn, it was clear that his eyes were almost closed. They had always been almost closed. He said his name was Vorulf, and that the one following them down the valley, with an old face in an icy chest, bears his likeness but not his soul, because Vorulf had dropped his soul onto the ice of the lake that night, when the ice took its toll from him. He said he didn't know why the ice had preserved his body and erased his memory, but he knows one thing. The Master is not afraid of fire. The Master has extinguished fire hundreds of times. The Master is afraid of the Guardian, who will agree to stand watch at the first hearth, because the chain is not waiting for firewood. The chain is waiting for a man. Down in the valley, Kettle's horn blared. The fortress spotted the train on the pass, and all around the siege perimeter, 107 white figures turned their heads toward the mountain at once. Dawn broke gray and windless, and in that deathly silence, the procession began its descent. Eirik walked 30 paces ahead of the lead wagon, holding an open brazier aloft with outstretched arms, and the snow before him glowed amber. Behind the wagons bearing shields, 40 children and 40 torches stretched in the chilly air, forming a single living garland. Idis brought up the rear with a box on her back. The siege ring watched them and did not move until they were 300 paces from it. And then the fortress did what Eirik and Kettle could not agree upon, and yet agreed upon without words. The gates of Skeldvik swung open, and a formation marched out. Kettle did not wait for the guests behind the wall. He led the spearmen out into the field to meet them, and from the rampart, pots filled with the last embers flew over the heads of the formation, clearing a corridor. The double blow shattered the ring before it had time to close in. What followed was an hour that Skeldvik would later call the Dawn of 40 Fires. Here, the wedge of carts enters the siege, and their spiked sides grind down the first figures. Here, the white giant knocks the lead cart onto its side, and Oddgeir and Sven hold the cart aloft with their bare hands, while the children pass beneath their elbows without breaking the chain of torches. Here, Bjorn, his fingers split open, hands the bow to the Vorn teenager, and the boy fires a flaming arrow into the eye socket of the figure looming over Sigrun. Here is Ingrid, from the watchtower, calling out the gaps in the ring with a voice free of tremor, and Kai below, hearing her through the roar, leads the carts through these gaps one by one. Here is Ketil with his formation, meeting the besiegers' counterattack, taking a wave of 30 figures upon their spears. And the formation of plowmen does not yield a single step. And here is the final moment. Idis, carrying the chest, runs the last 50 paces across the open field, and 3 figures rise up to cut her off from the broken ice. Eirik turns back against all plans, but Grim proves to be faster. The old man steps between Idis and the ice, empty-handed. The 3 white figures freeze before him. They gaze into his nearly closed eyes, as if looking into a mirror. And this brief pause is enough for Svein to arrive with his spear, and for Idis to carry the box through the gate. The gate crashed down. The besiegers retreated from the rampart and took up their former positions. The field smoldered with melted mounds. Not a single person from the fortress or the train perished, and Sigrun said that evening that such a thing never happens, and that the Hearths had settled their accounts today. That very night, in Skelvik's longhouse, they accomplished what they had set out to do by crossing the mountains. Idis placed the heart of the Vorn fire into the Halson family hearth, and the 2 flames stood side by side within a single stone without mingling, just as 2 voices stand side by side in a single song. The lines flared up across the entire arch at once, and Eirik read them aloud to the whole house. The hearths are united in a single stone. The rank is flame. There are 24 seats by the fire. The gifts are secured. A great transition has been opened to the 2 guardians. The settlement has crossed the threshold of survival. The house fell silent. Then Astrid wept, and the Vorna children laughed, and Torvald removed his cap before the hearth as if before a person. For 3 days, Skelvik lived as a fortress does when it receives reinforcements. The siege stood at the border and did not advance beyond the necklace, which now burned with the heat of a rank-level flame. 40 northern children dispersed to the village homes, and in every house where 2 settled, it grew warmer by 2 voices. Ragna and the scribe tallied the provisions of the 2 households, and found that there was enough food for 121 people. Between Kai's fish pit and Gunnar's mill would last until the thaw. Barely, but it would last. Kettle took the Vorn teenagers under his wing, and a day later, his horn was already summoning 150 people. Idis sat by the fire with Sigrun, poring over the books of the two clans, learning the southern runes while Sigrun studied the northern ones. As for Eirik, he walked along the rampart for all 3 days, gazing at the motionless ring and finding the silence hard to believe. And he was right. On the 4th night, the master came to speak. He did not launch an assault. As darkness fell beyond the siege lines, a tall throne rose from the broken ice, and upon the throne sat that which until then had walked among its servants. A body of blue ice 3 times the height of a man, and in its chest, as in an icy window, an old face slept with closed eyes. And when the face's lips began to move, the voice did not come from the air. The voice came from all the white figures at once, and from the frost on the walls of the houses, and from those standing on the rampart. It deafened their ears. The voice did not threaten. The voice proposed. It said that 200 years ago, a man named Vorulf had been afraid of dying on duty and had asked for a reprieve, and the ice had granted him a reprieve, but taken a little something in return. It said that ever since then, it had carried that little something within itself, and that it had long since ceased to weigh him down, but instead warmed him, because even in the coldest of times, there needed to be someone who remembered what it meant to want to live. It said it had not come to kill. Hunger. Hunger and frost kill, and he merely comes afterward. He said he was offering Skeldvik what he had offered every hearth in the chain: sleep. A long, warm sleep without fear, just as the Skeggi people now sleep by their stone, and that the village need only do one small thing: to hand over one person to the other side. The one who wears a foreign body without a soul. Vorulf. Because as long as the last keeper of the first fire walks the earth, the chain considers the post not abandoned, but merely left, and keeps the gate ajar for the cold, but not fully open. The voice said it would give them 3 days to decide, and that if the village made the wrong decision, on the 4th night it would show them what it had shown to Skeggi's hearth. The throne sank into the ice, and the ring closed ranks, and in the longhouse a heavy hum lingered until morning. The people did not say to cast him out, but the people said to ask. Bjorn said bluntly that one soulless old man against 120 living people was a calculation even a child could understand. Edis replied, her voice ringing out. She said that the village had already seen the arithmetic of the cold at Skeggi's gates, and that whoever pays the ice according to its demands pays forever. Grim listened in silence. Then he stood up, and he said that there was nothing to decide here, because the master himself had let slip the truth out of fear. The chain considers the post not abandoned as long as the last guardian is alive. That means the lock can be more than just left ajar. The lock can be locked. To do this, the guardian of the first fire must return to the first hearth, take his post, and the hearth must be burning. He said that his body remembers the path to the sanctuary through the ice, and that it takes 7 days to get there. He said there was only one thing he could not do. He could not light the first hearth, because the hearth recognizes only a keeper with a living soul, and his soul has lain somewhere in the ice of Lake Vornoff for 200 years. The house grew very quiet. Eric stared into the blazing fire and heard a decision taking shape within himself, one he already fully understood: that 2 living guardians must journey to the heart of the glacier through the army of frost, because the great passage is open only to 2. That those he loved would be left behind at home once again, and that the master would be waiting for them at the threshold of the sanctuary, because the master was not foolish, and had also heard every word just now. Eirik raised his head and met Idis's gaze above the flames. Idis was already nodding. The breakthrough at dawn, with 40 lights, amid the counterattack of Kettle's ranks, proceeded without losses. Moreover, Grim stopped the 3 white ones at the gates. They looked into his eyes as if into a mirror, and the heart of the Voron's fire settled into the Halson's hearth, raising its rank to a flame with 24 places, a great greater passage for 2 guardians, and a survival threshold of 121 people. The master appeared on an icy throne, with Vorulf's sleeping face in his chest, and granted 3 days to hand over Grimm, explaining that as long as the last keeper of the first fire is alive, the chain keeps the lock of the frogs ajar, but not open. Grimm revealed that the lock can be sealed if he returns to his post at the first hearth within 7 days' journey across the glacier. But the hearth must be lit by a keeper with a living soul, and his soul has lain in the ice of Lake Vornov for 200 years. Eirik and Idis silently decided to go together. They convened a council at dawn, and Eirik laid out the plan in its entirety, without hiding any of the terrifying details. 3 are heading to the sanctuary, himself, Idis, and Grimm, whose body remembers the way. But first, a detour, Lake Vornov. Because without Vorulf's soul, the first hearth cannot be lit, and that soul has lain in the ice of the lake for 200 years. As a result, the journey is extended by 2 days, and takes them through a valley that the cold has already devoured. The house remains with Kettle and Torvald, while the flame hearth falls to Astrid Sigrun and the permanent guests. And the main ruse for their escape, proposed by Grimm himself. The master gave them 3 days to hand over the old man. This means that at the end of the 3rd day, the village must carry out the handover. They must lead the figure in Grimm's cloak beyond the boundary and haggle and stall for time, while the real 3 escape via the northern channel that Kai checked out last night. They argued about only one thing: who would wear the cloak? 7 volunteered. Eirik chose the 8th, who hadn't volunteered. He chose Bjorn. He said, in front of everyone, that the one who knows how not to believe is the one who must lie, and that 3 weeks ago, Bjorn didn't believe in the hearth, but now his distrust would serve the fire. Bjorn looked at Eirik for a long time and then took the cloak. They spent a full day preparing. Over the course of the night, Gunnar reforged the brazier into a large carrying frame with a double flap and straps for the back. Ragna packed 9 days' worth of provisions into 2 shoulder baskets and a 3rd, smaller one on Grimm's chest. Sigrun drew symbols on all 3 hoods to ward off the blizzard's gaze and gave Eir his staff with a red-hot tip. Kai begged to be taken all the way to the lake, but Eirik refused. The boy wept bitterly and silently, yet in the morning he was still the first to stand at the northern gate to mark the start of the riverbed. They set out at dusk on the 3rd day, at the very hour when horns began to sound at the southern gates, and Bjorn, clad in a stranger's cloak, stepped across the threshold, his voice carrying words of trade across the field. Stuza listened to Bjorn. Stuza looked south. The 3 had gone north along the stream bed, and not a single white figure turned their head. The journey to the lake took 2 days and wound its way through the deathly whiteness. There they were, walking in single file along the bottom of the frozen stream, and above them stood such a bitter frost that their breath fell as frost on their chests. Here they spend the night in a snow cave where a brazier warms the 3 of them, and the lines give them steadfastness and a steady stride, while the hearth offers Grimm nothing because his soul has nowhere to receive the gift, and the old man simply sits closest to the fire and smiles at the warmth like a child. Now it is the 2nd day, and the ravaged Vorn Valley opens up from the ridge. The abandoned fence now stands half buried beneath the glacier's tongue, and Idis gazes at her ruined home for a single minute before turning away first. The lake greeted them with smooth, black ice, swept clean until it rang. Grimm stepped onto the ice and walked without hesitation, as bodies walk by memory. 100 paces from the shore, he stopped and said, "It's here." Here, 200 years ago, he had lain down to die, and here the ice had offered him a reprieve. Eirik lay down and gazed into the black depths. Below, 3 elbows' depth beneath the ice, a light hung. A small, warm, candle-colored flame burning deep within, like a midge trapped in amber. the guardian's soul, which the ice had neither released nor extinguished, but preserved as one would keep a pledge. They took turns chopping until darkness fell. The ice was not lake ice. It was that very black ice from which wedges are made, and the axes stuck in it like in pitch. Then Idas did what she and Sigrun had whispered about before they set out. She melted the red-hot tip of her staff into the bottom of the hole and traced a woven symbol around it. And the symbol began to devour the black ice, just as embers devour birch bark. By midnight, only a palm's width of ice remained between the soul and the world. And then the lake awoke. From the shores, white figures emerged all at once from every direction. Not 4 and not 10. Grim shouted that the master had left a guard at the pledge, and that the guard had been sleeping in the shores for all 200 years. What followed was the most terrifying hour of the journey. Eirik stood over the hole with an open brazier, and the light of the child held a circle 20 paces wide, and into this circle dozens of figures surged, one after another. Idas, elbow deep in the icy water, was completing the sign. Grim walked along the edge of the circle, and the white figures stumbled half a step before him, and those half steps were enough for the brazier. When the sign closed, the black palm of ice burst with a ringing sound, and a warm little flame rose of its own accord, just as an air bubble rises. Idas caught it in a clay pot filled with coals, and the flame settled into the coals and remained there. And at that very moment, all the white figures around the lake stopped. They turned around, and they walked away without looking back. Grim stood over the pot, staring at the flame, his hands trembling. He did not take it. He said he dared not until he took his post. But that night, for the first time in 200 years, his eyes opened fully, and Eirik saw that they were blue and young. In the morning, on the ridge above the lake, they looked back toward the south, and Eirik saw a column of smoke in the distant horizon above the Skeldvik Valley, not from a hearth, wide. And he realized that the lake's guardian hadn't simply gone away. The master had learned of the theft of the pledge. And the master had responded, not here. The master had responded where Eirik's heart lay. Grim placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke with stern certainty. 5 days back, 5 days forward to the sanctuary. There was only one way to save the home, to make it there. 5 days on the glacier took the hardest path of life, and Eirik remembered them as slices of time between which lay white pain. Here was the first day, and they were climbing the glacier's tongue along the crevasses that Grim bypassed without looking, because his body remembered every one of them. Here is the night in an ice grotto, where the brazier cannot be left open for long because the flame, nearing the end of its 12 days, already burns the color of straw rather than amber, and the countdown reads 2 days. Here is Idas on the 3rd morning, giving her share of oil to the brazier and lying that she isn't hungry. And Eirik pretends to believe her because they both go that the fire is more important than food right now. Here is the white mist of the 4th day, where there is neither top nor bottom, and they walk tied together by a strap, while Grim leads the way by the feel of the soles of their feet. And then comes the 5th day, and the wind suddenly dies down. The mist clears, and the heart of the glacier opens up before them. The sanctuary stood in an icy basin like a black tooth, a round tower made of the same dark stone as the hearths, only there was so much stone here that it took one's breath away. The ice approached the walls from all sides and froze at the stone's edge, not daring to touch it. And from the sanctuary's gates, a strip of pure black ice ran along a level path across the entire basin, and at the far end of the strip they were awaited. The master sat on a throne before the gates. His army stood around the throne, and Eirik did not bother to count them because the number was irrelevant. Hundreds. A voice rang out from every part of the basin's ice at once. The master said he was grateful that they had brought everything themselves: 2 living guardians, the last child of the southern flame, and the pledge. He said their village still stood because he knew how to wait, and that the smoke they had seen was from wood piles burning behind the rampart, not from houses. He said this calmly, as one speaks the truth, because he had no need to lie. He needed them to hear him out. He offered the exchange one last time. They would hand over the pot containing the soul and leave, all three of them, and the village survives that winter. He said he would even let the chain go south until spring, because it would return in the spring anyway, and the word cold is harder than any stone. And Eirik felt the weight of the offer. It weighed 121 lives. It wasn't he who answered. Grim answered. The old man stepped forward onto the black strip and spoke, his voice growing stronger with every word. He said that 200 years ago he had already made this exchange. He had given up a trifle in exchange for time, and that he sees the result of the exchange every time he sees his own face in someone else's icy chest. He said that the frost never deceives. The cold is worse. The cold fulfills the pact literally and eternally, and that the only words one can speak to it are words of fasting. He turned to Eirik and Edis and said, "Let's go." Then something happened that Eirik didn't understand with his mind at first, but later grasped with his heart. The army of the cold didn't rush at them like an avalanche. It parted before Grim and closed in behind them. The master couldn't touch the last guardian walking toward the post because the chain was watching. An ancient pact of the chain, the very pact that held the frost within the bowl, also held the frost itself. But the pact said nothing about the guardian's companions. And so, figures struck from the flanks, at Eirik, at Idis. The 300-step path to the gates became a battle in which they could not stop. Eirik walked with an open brazier, burning those who reached out from the right. Ida struck from the left with her staff and short bursts of fire from her box. Grim walked in the middle with a small pot pressed to his chest and could offer no help other than his stride, so he simply kept walking. Right at the gates, a giant with an ancient face pierced the light of the brazier with his chest, and his fist struck Idis. She was thrown back onto the ice, and the box containing the Vornau's heart of fire rolled down the black strip. Eirik darted after it and realized he couldn't reach both in time, so he chose Idis, and it was the right choice, though a terrifying one. The giant raised his foot over the box, and then the child of flame in Eirik's brazier did what no line of code had promised. It emerged of its own accord. It broke free from the coals as a golden drop, flew 10 paces, and settled into the box by the northern heart. A double flash reduced the giant to steam and cleared the gate, and the brazier in Eirik's hands went out. The line flickered in the empty embers one last time. The child had returned to its kin. The guardian was weakened. Weakness struck him immediately, like a blow to the knees. Eirik lifted Idis, picked up the box, and the three of them walked the last 20 paces, clinging to one another like drunks. The gates of the sanctuary recognized Grim. The dark stone parted before his palm and closed behind them, cutting off the howl of the bowl. Inside lay the silence of 200 years. A circular hall. Snow swept in through the cracks, and in the middle of the hall stood the first hearth of the chain. It was as huge as a house. Its arch bore hundreds of symbols, and all of them were lifeless. A man could stand upright in its mouth. Grim approached it as one approaches a father's coffin. Then he turned and said to do everything quickly, because the master would soon realize the only thing left for him to do. The sanctuary's walls were stone, and he could not break stone, but he could do what he had done to the Valley of the Vorns. He could submerge the entire sanctuary in the glacier. Bury the gates under 100 cubits of ice so that the outpost would stand while the guardians died of starvation inside and the hearth went out on its own. Outside, a distant, growing creaking had already begun along the walls. The ice of the basin was closing in on the tower from all sides. Idis threw back the lid of the box where the hearts of the Vorns and the child of the Halsons now burned as a single flame. Grim removed the little pot containing his soul from his chest, and his hands no longer trembled. Eirik stood between them, clutching the cold arch of the first hearth, and counted in his mind what he did not want to count aloud. Light the hearth, accept the, take up his post. All in all, they had exactly as much time as it took to walk 300 paces across the ice. In 5 days across the glacier, the three reached the sanctuary, where the master, accompanied by his army, offered one last exchange, a soul for the village's mercy until spring. But Grim refused, explaining that the cold takes such bargains literally and eternally. The chains pact forbade them from harming the guardian on his way to his post, and the three fought their way through the 300 paces. Moreover, the Child of Flame left Eirik's brazier of its own accord to save the hearts of the Vorns, which is why Eirik is weakened and the united fire is now a single flame in the brazier. Inside the sanctuary stands the dead first hearth, the size of a house, and the master has begun to heat the tower within the glacier. There are only 300 paces of ice left for kindling the fire, accepting the soul and taking up the post. Grim spoke quickly and clearly, as people do when they recall their craft. The first hearth is not lit with a flint. The first hearth is lit from the living fire of the chain and by the hand of a keeper with a living soul, and the words to kindle it must come from the heart, not the mouth. This is the order. First, he receives the soul, because a dead keeper of the fire cannot bring it. Then Eirik and Idis together bring the united flame into the mouth of the cave, because after the loss of his child, Eirik alone would not have the strength to sustain the transfer. Then Grim takes his post at the mouth of the cave. He said this evenly, and only on the last word did his voice falter, because all three knew what the post meant. The post means to remain. The walls hummed. The ice was coming. Grim took the little pot in both hands, raised it to his chest, and breathed out his old name. Vorulf, son of Word, keeper of the first fire, returns. A warm little flame rose from the embers of its own accord. It did not fly into his chest like an arrow. It settled on his chest like a bird alights, and soaked in like water into dry earth. And the old man doubled over. He screamed. Eirik understood why. For 200 years the body had lived without a soul and felt nothing. But now the soul had returned and brought everything back all at once. All the memories, all the shame of that night on the lake, everyone who had perished in the chain, whom he had failed to protect. Grim knelt and screamed, and Idis held him by the shoulders and whispered simple words into his ear, that he had made it, that he had returned, that the post awaits. The old man fell silent. He raised his head, and Eirik saw Grim's third face over the past few days. Not the empty face of a man without memory, nor the guilty face of one who had remembered. The face of a guardian, calm and very weary. From then on, they worked in silence and in unison, like a single pair of hands. Eirik and Idis took hold of the chest from both sides and opened the large clasp. The line of kinship unfolded before them both. Two guardians carry a single fire. The fire rose above the chest like a golden sheaf as tall as a man, and it did not burn their palms, but rested upon them as a banner rests upon its pole. They carried it to the mouth of the first hearth, and the flame descended from their hands onto the ancient coals, 200 years old, and nothing happened. The coals did not catch fire. The symbols on the arch did not flare up. The sheaf stood on the dead stone and could not take root. Outside, a blast struck the walls so hard that snow rained down from the dome. The ice reached the tower and began its ascent. Vorulf stared at the dead stone for a moment, then said quietly that he understood. The hearth would not accept the fire because it had been brought in. And according to the ancient pact, the first hearth of the chain accepts the flame only as a gift from the guardian's blood. That was how it had been lit for the first time at the dawn of the chain. Blood on the coals and a word from the heart. He pulled out his knife, and Eirik grabbed his hand because he saw what he saw. A line that unfurled in a golden sheaf for the two of them and Idis. The first hearth demands a gift of blood from the guardians who bring it. Two brought it. To two it shall be given. Eirik said this aloud. Idis was already rolling up her sleeve. They slit their palms over the coals. His knife, her knife, and two streams of blood fell into the golden sheaf. And Eirik spoke from the heart, without choosing his words, saying that he was offering this fire just as one offers water to the thirsty and bread to the hungry. Idis said she was offering it just as one offers a home to a guest. And the first hearth of the chain sighed. There was no other way to describe it. A vast maw drew in air from the entire hall, and the golden sheaf vanished into the embers root and all. In an arc the size of a house, hundreds of symbols raced across the sky, igniting one after another, and a flame roared to life, one that Eirik had never seen before. It was white with gold, and one did not wish to shield oneself from it. Lines flared within it so large they could be read across the entire hall. The first link in the chain has been awakened. The chain is gathering. Skjeldvik answers. The Vorns answer. And then came names Eirik did not know. Distant links that even the books had remained silent about. 8 names. 9. 11. The chain was awakening across the entire north, just as windows awaken in a city at night. And from outside, the master cried out, not with a voice from the figures, but with his own voice. And that cry was such that the ice on the sanctuary's walls spattered with cracks. The screech of the ascent cut short. Vorulf stepped toward the mouth of the fire. Right by the fire, he turned and said one last thing to the two of them. He said that the post was not death, and that they should not look at him as if he were already dead. Fasting is work. He would hold the castle, and the castle would hold its master, and the master would grow weaker with every link in the chain that awoke, because the cold is strong only where warmth has surrendered. He said he had one request for the two of them, that the fire in Skjeldvik should never be left with just one keeper, never, under any sky. Loneliness is the door through which the ice enters. He knows this better than anyone alive. Then he smiled, and Eirik remembered for the rest of his life that the smile of the keeper of the first fire was as light as a boy's. And Vorulf stepped into the mouth of the fire. The white flame embraced him without burning him. He stood in the fire as one stands in the doorway of one's own home, and the signs of the ark flared to their full strength. A sound rolled across the entire basin beyond the walls, a sound that Eirik did not recognize at first. The ice was receding. For the first time in 200 years, the ice at the heart of the glacier was retreating. The gates of the sanctuary parted of their own accord before the two guardians. The basin outside was empty. No throne, no army, only trampled, churned-up ice settling before their eyes. And far to the north, on the horizon, a blue glow fading into the distance. The master retreated into the depths of the glacier to heal the first wound in 200 years. Idis stood in the doorway and wept, making no attempt to hide her face. Eirik looked south. There, a 5-day journey away, lay his home, and he did not yet know what awaited him there, or with whom. But the box behind his back was warm, and the weakness following the loss of the child no longer weighed on him, for the first link in the chain had given both guardians a line that Eirik had already read as he descended from the basin. Guardians, givers. The chain is in debt, the gifts are multiplied. The return journey took 4 days instead of 5, because winter all around was changing before their eyes, and this change was etched into their memory in flashes like a foreign miracle. On the first day, they encountered not a single white figure on the glacier, and the crevasses were filled with blue meltwater, something that never happens in the middle of winter. On the second day, above the dead valley of Skeggi, they see birds. The raven returned first, as it always does. Here they spend the night without Sigrun's circle for the first time in a month, because the box gives off heat like a small hearth, and the lines give both of them 10 units of blood warmth. On the third day, from the Saddle Pass, they can see how the tongue of the glacier over the Vorn Valley has stopped and settled, and from beneath its edge protrudes the freed gable of their hut's roof. Eides looks at this in silence for a very long time. Then she says that in the spring, the Vorn will return home, and her voice doesn't tremble, but rings out. And now it's the fourth day, and the last pass, and Skjeldvik lies below. Eirik stopped and looked, unable to breathe evenly. The fortress stood. The rampart stood. The necklace wasn't burning because there was no need for it. There was no siege ring. The field around the rampart lay in melted mounds, as if after the ice breakup. And from the gates, small figures were already running toward them across the snow. Ingrid was racing ahead of everyone on skis, followed by Kai and Leif. They were greeted at home so enthusiastically that Eirik later couldn't recall the first half hour at all. He remembered hands, dozens of hands. He remembered how Astrid was crying out loud, how Kettle silently squeezed his shoulder, and that was worth more than any words. How Sigrun cupped Idis's face in her hands and said that the Northern Guardian had come home. That evening, in the longhouse before the Rang fire, they took turns telling their stories, and the two tales merged into one. The village told its story. At the end of the third day, the market, Bjorn's market, opened because the master had gone to speak with the sanctuary, and without his voice, the servants turned into nothing but malevolent ice. The siege struck in earnest. The woodyards were ablaze, and the rampart cracked at the eastern corner, held together by bodies and runes for 2 days. There were 11 wounded. Again, not a single one was killed, and Sigrun said she had long since ceased to be surprised. And on the fifth night, all 107 figures stopped at once. They stood still, and they settled in heaps, just as a snowdrift settles under the spring sun. That very night, the Halson's hearth flared up of its own accord, white and gold, and foreign names flashed across its arc. Sigrun read the word Vorulf among them, and the village understood that the journey had come to an end. Eirik told their tale of the lake and the soul, of the Dar and the 300 paces, about how the child of the flame chose of its own accord to return to its kin, about the blood of two upon the ancient embers, and about the man who now stands in the white fire at the very north of the world, holding the door open for them all. When he finished, there was such silence in the house that you could hear the flame singing. And then Bjorn stood up. The skeptic of all skeptics stood there with a mug, searching for words, and found these. He said that all his life he had believed only in what could be weighed, and that today he had weighed it. There were 81 people in Skjeldvik at the beginning of winter. 121 are sitting by this fire now. That is his faith, and let anyone try to dispute it. The house answered him with the clatter of spoons, the loudest clatter these walls had ever heard. Weeks followed, filled with the routine of peaceful labor, and for the first time all winter, Eirik allowed himself to see them not as a guardian, but as human beings. Now it's February, and the thaw has come a month ahead of schedule. Kai and the scouts are marking out the summer road to the gorge through the settling snow. Now Oddgeir's builders are beginning to clear the avalanche in Wolf's Maw, and the work that seemed endless turns out to be a 3-week job because the chain of debt and the thread of the gift now burns over everyone who steps out with an axe. Here, Gunnar is installing a second wheel on the stream and telling anyone who will listen that mechanics is the same as a hearth, only for iron. Here Idis and Sigrun spend their evenings transcribing into a single book, and Idis is staying in Skeldvik until spring because there are now two guardians, and Vorof's will is being fulfilled of its own accord, while Eirik catches himself thinking that the phrase, "until spring," appeals to him less and less, and he wants a different phrase. And so it is March, and the day has come when the dugout road has been closed off, and the first strangers have entered the pass from the south, a royal detachment, 10 riders on exhausted horses, and an officer with a frostbitten face. The officer looked at the village, which, according to all the capital's records, had been listed as destroyed along with the entire north, and could not wipe the astonishment from his face. He explained why the longhouse had fallen silent. The winter that Skeldvik had survived was not just their winter. That year, the cold reached as far south as the southernmost provinces. Rivers that never froze were frozen solid. The kingdom had lost count of the villages, and the capital sent out patrols throughout all the northern valleys, not to help. The capital was seeking an answer to one question. Why, in the darkest winter in 200 years, in the midst of the dead north, were certain valleys still alive and warm? And why were people speaking of them around nighttime campfires as if they were a miracle? The officer laid a map on the table, and the rumors were marked with dots on it. There were 11 dots. Eirik looked at the map and recognized them. These were the strongholds of the chain. All of them had awakened. The officer said that a month after his patrol, the king's envoy would arrive with full authority, and that this man would bring questions. Who had lit the fires? Who was in control? And to whom it would all belong? He left the next day, taking with him a wagon load of answers. Some he'd been given, others he hadn't. That evening, Eirik sat by the hearth next to Idis and thought about how his grandfather had been right about everything except one thing. His grandfather had written that the cold was the most fearsome guest from the north. His grandfather hadn't finished writing that after the cold, a guest from the south always arrives, and that the hearth must also be ready for its arrival. The return journey took 4 days as winter retreated, and back home it turned out that the siege had intensified in earnest after the revelation of Bjorn's bargain. But on the night the first hearth was lit, all 107 figures settled into place, and the Halson's hearth flared white, taking on the names of the awakened chain of 11 hearths. The village survived the winter without a single casualty, growing from 81 to 121 people. Idis remained the second guardian, according to Vorulf's will, and the road through the avalanche was cleared in 3 weeks. A royal delegation brought news that a black winter had settled over the entire kingdom, that the capital had marked on the map 11 living, warm valleys coinciding with the chain, and that in a month the king's envoy would arrive with questions. Who lit the fire? Who owns it? And to whom it will belong? The king's envoy arrived in mid-April, when the last snow had melted from the roofs of Skeldvik, and Ragnar's first caravan had already set off southward with fish, salt, and planks. His name was Lord Eskel. He was a middle-aged, gaunt man with watchful eyes, accompanied by a scribe, 2 lawmen, and 20 soldiers. He rode through the gate, expecting to see a remote village with a marvelous stove, and for 3 days he silently gazed at what he saw instead. The villagers later recalled those 3 days with a chuckle. There was the Lord, standing by the restored mill, listening as Gunnar explained the second wheel, while the Lord's scribe could barely keep up with taking notes. Here he is watching Kettle's drills, where 150 militiamen are reforming at the sound of a horn faster than his own guards. Here he is in Sigrun's house, leafing through the transcribed book of the 2 clans, his hands moving with great care. Here he is on the rampart, touching a melted emblem with his finger and remaining silent for a long time. And here comes the evening of the 3rd day, the longhouse, and the conversation for which he had traveled for a month. Eskel spoke plainly, and Eirik appreciated that. Over the winter, the crown had lost 1/9 of its subjects. The crown is frightened. In the capital, there are those who demand that the fire-worshipping settlements be declared acts of witchcraft and extinguished, while others demand that they be taken into the treasury and that every official and garrison be stationed there. Lord Eskel had been sent to determine what advice to give the king, and he asked Eirik, in front of the entire household, who controlled the fire. Eirik answered as he had decided a month earlier by the flames, together with Idis and the council. He said that no one controlled the fire, just as no one controlled the well from which the road drank. The fire has its guardians and its covenant. And he laid out before the Lord the covenant of the chain, written by Sigrun on tanned leather. Hearth places are not sold, not given away, and not taken by force, because a hearth place taken by force goes out. And this is not a threat, but a natural property. The guardians are chosen by the flame, not by a charter. Every hearth welcomes any guest, regardless of lineage or wealth. And the chain is ready to serve the kingdom in one single way, the same way it has always served, to keep the north warm and alive, and to train new guardians if the flame acknowledges them. The lawmakers protested that the crown does not make pacts with its subjects. And then Idis stood up and said calmly that the crown could, of course, send soldiers. The soldiers will occupy the house and the stone, and the flame will retreat into the void, just as it did from the Valley of the Horns. And the crown will be left with a cold stone and a dead north, and everything will start all over again. She said this without a hint of defiance, as one might recite a weather forecast, and yet it carried more weight than any challenge. Eskel was silent for a long time. Then he asked one final question. How will the village prove that the fire will not become a force against the crown? It was not the keeper who answered. Torvald rose from the ranks and said it would be proven by the numbers. 81 men met the winter. 121 saw it through. Not a single casualty throughout the entire war against the cold. 3 foreign caravans were sheltered on the road during the spring. Northern orphans sit in this hall, and let the Lord ask them himself whose people they are now. Against whom could a force that thinks this way possibly stand? Eskel left a week later, taking with him the chain's covenant bearing his seal, placed beside the ashes of the hearth, and a promise that he would advise the king with the word alliance rather than the word treasury. In the summer, a letter arrived from the capital. The king recognized the chain of hearth as a free northern alliance under his authority, exempted the valleys of the chain from taxes for 10 years, and asked for one thing: to accept and train 12 apprentices from the ravaged southern lands, if the flame recognized them. In the fall, the first apprentices arrived in Skeldvik, and the hearth accepted 9 of them. Eirik taught them what winter had taught him, that a gift is not a reward, but a duty, that fire only strengthens what is already alive within a person, and that solitude is a gateway to ice, which is why there are always 2 guardians. He fulfilled his second duty at the end of summer. He and Idis were married at the hearth before all of Skeldvik, and in the presence of guests from all 11 valleys. And Sigrun conducted the ceremony according to the book of the 2 clans, and the line in the flame that evening was short. The hearth of the Halson and Vorn clans. The house was full. The Vorns returned to their valley the following spring, just as Idis had promised, and their fence rose from beneath the melted ice almost intact. The Vorn's hearth was lit from a box carried back along the same route, only now via the summer road, and without a single white figure along the entire way. Kai grew up to become the lead scout of the chain, and led the caravans between the valleys. Ingrid left as an apprentice for the distant western hearth, and 3 years later, the flame recognized her as its guardian. Bjorn remained with Eirik and grumbled until old age that he didn't believe any of it. Gunnar set up wheels in 5 valleys, and his son was already laying out the 6th. And at the end of the 3rd winter, Eirik and Idis journeyed north once more, the 2 of them traveling along the strengthened chain from hearth to hearth all the way to the sanctuary. The white flame stood steady at the mouth of the valley, and within the flame stood Vorolf, and he recognized them. He could not speak from within the fire, but the signs formed by the ark spelled out words for them. The master sleeps deeply. The chain holds. The watch is no burden. Go home. And the last sign was not a word, but that very same light, boyish glow that Eirik remembered in the old man's smile. They went home. The road south lay through living valleys, and in each one a warm home and a place by the fire awaited them. Eirik walked and thought about how it all began. A skinny hair on his back, laughter by the mill, the freezing house of the mad old man, and a spark in the darkness. The old man had written that the fire remembers more people than anyone else, and for 30 years the village had dismissed this as nonsense. Grandfather turned out to be right. The fire did remember. It remembered everyone who sat beside it and returned to each person their truest self. That was the essence of the system of Hearth and its entire secret, not in lines of text or numbers, but in the fact that warmth given to others does not diminish but multiplies, and that no cold in the world can stand against this simple arithmetic. Back home in Skeldvik, they were met by smoke rising above the rooftops, and Ingrid's cry from the watchtower, and the hearth of the Halson and Vorn families burned with a steady, strong flame, just as it would always burn, because now there was someone to tend it. The return journey took 4 days instead of 5 because the winter around us was changing before our very eyes, and this change etched itself into our memory in snapshots like a miracle from another world. On the first day, they encountered not a single white figure on the glacier, and the crevasses were filled with blue meltwater, something that never happens in the middle of winter. Grim said that the glacier breathes through, and Eirik himself could feel it through the soles of his feet. The ice beneath his feet no longer rang with malice. The ice simply lay there, like a sleeping beast from which a splinter had been removed. On the second day, above the dead valley of Skeggi, they saw birds. The raven returned first, as it always does. Idis stopped and suggested they go inside. They descended into the dead village, and Eirik did what he had planned on the way to the sanctuary. He brought the box to Skeggi's cracked hearth, pressed its warm side against the cold crack, and read in the box's flame the line he had been waiting for. The Skeggi clan's hearth remembers. The rift is deep. Healing is possible from the first fire after a year of warmth. They buried the people sitting by the stone in snowy niches inscribed with Sigrun's runes, which Idis knew by heart, and Idis spoke the northern words of farewell over them. As he left, Eirik glanced back at the scratched inscription at the gate, and thought that whoever had left it had, after all, triumphed. His words had been believed. His words had saved them all. Here they were, spending the night without Sigrun's circle for the first time in a month, because the box gave off heat like a small hearth, and the runes gave both of them 10 units of blood warmth. They sat by the box, and for the first time during the entire journey, Idis spoke of something other than the mission. She spoke of her childhood in the Vorn Valley, of her father, who had taught her to read the runes before she learned the letters, about the white strand of hair that appeared on her head the night the hearth recognized her as its guardian. Eirik listened and caught himself wishing this conversation would never end. It's the 3rd day now, and from the saddle pass they can see how the glacier's tongue over the Vorn Valley has stopped and settled, and from beneath its edge, the freed ridge of their fence. Idis stares at it in silence for a very long time. Then she says that in the spring, the Vorns will return home, and her voice doesn't tremble, it rings out. And now it's the 4th day and the final pass, and Skeldvik lies below. Eirik stopped and stared, unable to catch his breath. The fortress stood. The rampart stood. The necklace wasn't burning because there was no need for it. There was no siege ring. The field around the rampart lay in melted mounds, as if after the ice breakup, and from the gates, small figures were already running toward them across the snow. Ingrid was racing ahead of everyone on skis, followed by Kai and Leif. They were greeted at home so warmly that Eirik later couldn't recall the first half hour at all. He remembered hands, dozens of hands. He remembered how Astrid wept aloud, how Ketil silently squeezed his shoulder, and that was worth more than any words. How Sigrun cupped Adis's face in her hands and said that the Northern Guardian had come home. He remembered how Leif and Kai tugged at his sleeves, each trying to speak first, and how Ogier stood a little apart, wiping his eyes with his mitten and pretending snow had gotten in them. That evening, in the longhouse before the Rang fire, they took turns telling their stories, and the two tales merged into one. The village told its story. At the end of the third day, Bjorn's market fell apart because the master had gone to speak with the sanctuary, and without his voice, the servants turned into nothing but malevolent ice. Bjorn barely made it back over the rampart alive, and they hauled him up on a rope amid a hail of icy fists. The siege had turned serious. The woodyards were ablaze, and the rampart cracked at the eastern corner, held together by bodies and runes for 2 days. Ketil did not leave the wall for 3 days, and became so hoarse that Ingrid blew the trumpet from the watchtower, following his hand signals. That night, Sigrun burned every last handful of the hearth soot, and the wise old women scraped soot directly from the mouth of the still hot hearth. There were 11 wounded. Once again, not a single one was killed, and Sigrun said she had long since ceased to be surprised. And on the 5th night, all 107 figures stopped at once. They stood still, and they settled into heaps, just as a snowdrift settles under the spring sun. That very night, the Halson's hearth flared up of its own accord, white and gold, and foreign names flashed across its arc, and Sigrun read the word Vorulf among them, and the village knew that the expedition had succeeded. The people on the rampart embraced and wept, and Thorvald ordered the victory horn to be sounded, even though the last figures were still wandering across the field. Eirik told their tale of the lake and the soul beneath the black ice, of the chalice and the 300 paces through the army, of how the child of flame chose of its own accord to return to its kin and save the heart of the Voruns, about the blood of 2 on ancient coals and how the first hearth breathed life, and about the man who now stands in white fire at the very north of the world, holding the door open for all of them. When he reached Vorulf's final smile, even those in the longhouse who had never seen the old man began to weep. The Vorun children listened, standing. For them, it was a tale about the grandfather they had fed from their hands and who had carved toys for them. When Eirik finished, there was such silence in the house that you could hear the flames singing. And then Bjorn rose. The skeptic of all skeptics stood there with a mug and his head bandaged from the siege, searched for words, and found these. He said that all his life he had believed only in what could be weighed, and that today he had weighed it. There were 81 people in Skeldvik at the beginning of winter. 121 are sitting by this fire now. That is his faith, and let anyone try to dispute it. The house answered him with the clatter of spoons, and it was the loudest clatter these walls had ever heard. Weeks followed, filled with the rhythm of peaceful labor, and for the first time all winter, Eirik allowed himself to see them not as a guardian, but as human beings. Now it's February, and the thaw has come a month ahead of schedule, and Kai, along with the scouts, is marking out the summer road to the gorge in the settling snow. Now Odgeir's builders are beginning to clear the avalanche in Wolf's Maw, and the work that seemed endless turns out to be a 3-week job, because the chain of debt and the thread of the gift now burns over everyone who goes out with an axe. Sven found the bodies of 2 messengers in the avalanche snow who hadn't made it through the fall, and they were buried with honors as the first fallen of this winter, even though they had fallen before the war. Now Gunnar is installing a second wheel on the stream and telling anyone who will listen that mechanics is just a hearth, but for iron. His son follows him with a piece of charcoal and a board, sketching everything his father says. Here Ragna is opening a trading post in the former caravan barn and counting future caravans, and the scribe, looking at her ledgers, says he hasn't seen such accounts even in the capital. In the evenings, Idis and Sigrun transcribe the two family records into a single book, and Idis stays in Skeldvik until spring because there are now two guardians, and Vorulf's will is being carried out of its own accord. Meanwhile, Eirik catches himself realizing that he likes the phrase "until spring" less and less, and wants to find another way to put it. One evening, Idis caught his gaze over the book and did not look away, and Sigrun gathered her papers and left early, muttering that it was time for old eyes to sleep and that young eyes could see better. And so March arrived, along with the day when the dugout road was completed and the first strangers entered the pass from the south. A royal patrol. 10 riders on exhausted horses and an officer with a frostbitten face. The officer looked at the village, which, according to all the capital's records, was listed as having perished along with the entire north, and could not wipe them his face. His men were warmed by the hearth, and 3 of them received gifts before dawn. The next morning, the officer questioned his sergeant at length about why he had spent the entire night mending the harness, something he had never done in his life. The officer explained why the longhouse had fallen silent. The winter that Skeldvik had survived was not just their winter. That year, the cold reached even the southernmost provinces. Rivers that never froze were frozen solid. Port cities were encased in ice. The kingdom had lost count of the villages, and in the capital, the winter was already being called the Black Winter, and the capital sent out messengers throughout all the northern valleys, not to offer help. The capital was seeking an answer to one question: why, in the darkest winter in 200 years, in the midst of the dead north, were certain valleys still alive and warm, and why were people talking about them around nighttime campfires as if they were a miracle? The officer laid a map on the table. Rumors were marked on it with dots. There were 11 dots. Eirik looked at the map and recognized them. These were the hubs of the chain, all of them awakened. The officer said that a month after his departure, the king's envoy would arrive with full authority, and that this man was bringing questions. Who lit them? Who controls them? And to whom it will all belong? He left the next day, taking with him a wagon load of answers, both those he'd been given and those he hadn't. And that evening, Eirik sat by the hearth next to Idis and thought about how his grandfather had been right about everything except one thing. His grandfather had written that the cold is the most terrifying guest from the north. His grandfather hadn't finished writing that after the cold, a guest from the south always arrives, and that the hearth must also be ready for his arrival. A council was convened the very next day, and for the month leading up to the king's envoy's arrival, the village prepared for a new siege, only this time a siege of words. Sigrun and Idis wrote down the terms of the alliance on tanned leather, checking every word. Torvald and the scribe recorded the tally of the winter in a book filled with numbers and names. Kettle mustered the militia, not for battle, but for show, because visible strength spares one from having to use actual force. And Eirik, through Kai, sent messengers throughout all 11 valleys of the chain with a single question. And by mid-April, he received 11 identical answers. The chain spoke with one voice: fire is not for sale. On the way back, Eirik placed the box against Skeggi's split hearth and learned that the split could be healed by the first fire after a year of warmth. And back home, it turned out that the village had withstood a 2-day siege after Bjorn's bargain was revealed, and on the night the first hearth was lit, all 107 figures settled into place, and the hearth flared white, accepting the names of the 11 awakened hearths in the chain. The village survived the winter without a single casualty, growing from 81 to 121 people. Idas remained the second guardian. A bond was growing between her and Eirik, and the road was dug through in 3 weeks. The royal delegation brought news of the Black Winter throughout the kingdom, along with a map showing 11 warm valleys. And a month later, the king's envoy arrived with questions about who possessed the fire, and the chain, having prepared for a month, replied with 11 voices that fire was not for sale. The king's envoy arrived in mid-April, when the last snow had melted from the roofs of Skeldvik, and Ragnar's first caravan had already set off southward, with fish, salt, and planks. His name was Lord Eskil. He was a middle-aged, gaunt man with watchful eyes, accompanied by a scribe, 2 lawmen, and 20 soldiers. He rode through the gates, expecting to see a remote village with a marvelous stove, and for 3 days he silently gazed at what he saw instead. The villagers later recalled those 3 days with a chuckle. There stood the Lord by the restored mill, listening as Gunnar explained the second wheel, while the Lord's scribe could barely keep up with taking notes. Here he is watching kettles drill, where 150 militiamen are reforming at the sound of the horn faster than his own guards, and Eirik sees the Lord casting a sidelong glance at his captain, while the captain pretends to look the other way. Here he is in Sigrun's house, leafing through the transcribed Book of the Two Houses, and his hands grow very cautious, just as the hands of a man who has realized he is holding something older than the kingdom itself. There he is on the rampart, touching a melted emblem with his finger and remaining silent for a long time. Here he is in Ragnar's trading courtyard, and the merchant's widow lays out the caravan accounts before him. The Lord asks how much she wants to keep such accounts in the capital, and Ragnar replies that she already keeps them here, and there needed more here. And now it's the evening of the 3rd day, and the longhouse is full of people, and the conversation he'd traveled a month for is taking place. Eskil spoke plainly, and Eirik this. Over the winter, the crown has lost 1/9 of its subjects. The crown is frightened, and a frightened government is more dangerous than a starving one. In the capital, there are those who demand that the cults be declared witchcraft and eradicated, while others demand that they be brought into the treasury and placed under the supervision of every official and garrison. There is also a third group that proposes simply imposing a tax on the warm valleys so that the question of ownership resolves itself. Lord Eskil has been sent to decide what to advise the king, and his conscience demands that he first understand and then advise. And so, in front of the entire household, he asked Eirik who controls the fire. Eirik replied, as he had decided a month earlier, by the flame, together with Idas and the council. He said that no one owns the fire, just as no one owns the well from which the road drinks. The fire has guardians and a covenant, and he laid out before the Lord the pact of the chains, written by Sigrun on tanned leather. Hearth places are not sold, not given away, and not taken by force, because a hearth place taken by force goes out, and this is not a threat, but a natural property. The flame chooses its guardians, not a charter nor blood. For Eirik himself was the son of a drunkard, whom the village considered a good-for-nothing. Every hearth welcomes any guest without regard to lineage or wealth, and the Lord's soldiers warmed themselves by this fire for 3 nights. Let the Lord ask them what they received and what was asked of them. And the chain is ready to serve the kingdom in one and only one way, the same way it has always served, to keep the north warm and alive, and to train new guardians if the flame accepts them. The lawmen murmured that the crown does not make pacts with its subjects, and that such a precedent would destroy the order of the realm. The eldest among them rose and asked with cold politeness what would prevent the crown from simply sending in troops. And then Adis stood up and said calmly that the crown could, of course, send soldiers. The soldiers would occupy the house and the stone, and the flame would retreat into the void, just as it had vanished from the Valley of the Horns right before her eyes. And the crown would be left with a cold stone and a dead north, and everything would begin anew, only this time without the chain linking the kingdom to the frost. She said this without a hint of defiance, as if reciting a weather forecast forecast, and this made her words carry more weight than any challenge. Eskel was silent for a long time. Then he asked one last question. How would the village prove that the fire would not become a force against the crown, since he had seen the drills and the rampart, and he was not blind? It was not the keeper who answered. Torvald rose from the ranks and said that it would be proven by the numbers. 81 men faced the winter. 121 saw it through. Not a single casualty in the entire war against the cold. 3 foreign caravans were sheltered on the road during the spring, and one of them was royal. The northern orphans sit in this hall, and let the Lord ask them himself whose side they're on now. Against whom could a force that counts like this possibly stand? The Lord looked at the Voron children, and the children looked at him without fear, as do those who have already seen things more terrifying than any lord. And then something happened that no one had anticipated. Bjorn rose from the corner, asked to speak, and said he wanted to speak as a man who had not believed. He spoke of the council where he had argued against the expedition to the north, of Grim's cloak and the bargain with the cold, of how the village had chosen between arithmetic and a bargain, and had chosen the bargain and turned out to be right, because the arithmetic of ice always favors the ice. He told the Lord that he now stood in the same place where Bjorn had stood that winter, facing something that could not be weighed, and that Bjorn advised the Lord to do what had been so difficult for him to do himself, to sit by the fire. Just sit by the fire for one night before writing to the king. The house fell silent. Eskel looked at Bjorn for a very long time. Then he stood up, removed his sword from his belt, handed it to the captain, and sat down in the guest seat by the hearth. He sat by the flames until late into the night, and no one heard what he was silently thinking. And in the morning, Eirik saw a line above him that had faded with the dawn, and told no one what it had said. Judgmental disposition, clear gaze, 10. Eskel left a week later, taking with him the chain agreement bearing his seal, placed beside the ashes of the hearth, and a promise that he would advise the king to choose the word alliance rather than the word treasury. As he took his leave, he told Eirik one thing not meant for the scrolls. He said that in 40 years of service, for the first time he had seen a place where strength and kindness did not conflict with one another, and that if the king did not understand his report, he would return here, no longer in office, and ask for a place by the fire. In the summer, a letter with a gold seal arrived from the capital. The king recognized the chain of hearths as a free northern union under his authority, exempted the valleys of the chain from taxes for 10 years, and requested 2 things: to accept and train 12 apprentices from the ravaged southern lands, if the flame recognized them, and to record for the royal library the tale of the Black Winter as the North had witnessed it. The entire household spent the whole fall writing the tale. Sigrun guided the pen, and they all corrected it together. That fall, the first apprentices arrived in Skelvik, and the hearth accepted 9 of the 12. The 3 who were not accepted did not leave, but simply stayed to live and work, and a year later, the flame accepted them as well, because the hearth looks not at the day, but at the person. Eirik taught them what winter had taught him, that a gift is not a reward, but a duty, that fire only strengthens what is already alive within a person, and therefore the keeper's main work lies not with the flame, but among the people, and that solitude is a gateway for ice, which is why there are always 2 keepers, or better yet, more. He fulfilled his second duty at the end of summer. He and Idis were married by the hearth in the presence of all of Skeldvik and guests from all 11 valleys, and Sigrun conducted the ceremony according to the book of the 2 clans. Kettle stood behind Eirik's shoulder as the groom's father, and Ragna stood behind Idis's shoulder as the bride's mother, and no one asked why, because everyone understood why. The line in the flame that evening was short, and both of them saw it. The hearth of the Halson and Vorn clans. The house was full. The Vorns returned to their valley the following spring, just as Idis had promised, and their fence rose from beneath the melted ice, almost intact. The Vorn's hearth was lit from a box carried back along the same route, only now via the summer road, with a wagon train and songs, and without a single white figure along the entire way. Idis, that year, had lived between two homes, just as a bridge spans two shores, and both shores considered her their own. Kai grew up to become the Chan's chief scout and led caravans between the valleys. His map of the north was later placed in the royal library, alongside the tale of the Black Winter. Ingrid left as an apprentice for the distant western hearth, and 3 years later, the flame recognized her as its guardian, and she became the youngest guardian of the chain. Leif stayed with his mother and at the hearth, and he could hear the water beneath the earth, so well diggers from all over the north bowed to him. Bjorn stayed with Eirik and, until old age, grumbled that he didn't believe in any of it. Yet every evening he was the first to take his place by the fire. Gunnar set up wheels in 5 valleys, and his son was already designing the 6th. Oddgeir and Sven rebuilt the village of Skeggi by the 3rd autumn, and when, a year later, the heat from the first fire had healed the crack in Skeggi's hearth as bone heals, young families from the 3 valleys moved there, and the dead village came back to life. And this was the victory that Eirik considered the most important. And at the end of the 3rd winter, Eirik and Idis set out once more for the north, the two of them traveling along the now strengthened chain from hearth to hearth all the way to the sanctuary. The journey that had once taken 9 days of fear was now a chain of warm overnight stops. A white flame burned steadily at the mouth of the cave, and standing within the flame was Vorulf, who recognized them. He could not speak from within the fire, but the signs formed by the arc of the flames spelled out words for them. The master sleeps deeply, the chain holds, the watch is no burden, go home. And the last sign was not a word, but that very same light, boyish and gentle, that Eirik remembered in the old man's smile. They stood by the fire as long as one stands by the fire of a loved one, and then they went home. The road south lay through living valleys, and in each one a warm home and a place by the fire awaited them. And children ran out to look at the guardians of the Black Winter, about whom songs were already being sung around the campfires. Eirik walked and thought about how it all began. A skinny hair on his back, laughter by the mill, the freezing house of the mad old man, and a spark in the darkness that caught fire on the first try, as if it had been waiting. The old man wrote that fire remembers more people than they do, and for 30 years the village had considered this nonsense. Grandfather turned out to be right. The fire did remember. It remembered everyone who sat beside it, and returned to each one their truest self. To the plowman, a dream of ships. To the old woman, the songs of her grandmothers. To the homeless soldier, the formation that became his home. To the fatherless boy, a sense of living water. In this lay the entire system of Hearth and all its mystery. Not in lines, nor in numbers, nor in ranks. It lay in the fact that warmth given to others does not diminish, but multiplies, and that no cold in the world can stand against this simple arithmetic, because cold knows only how to take, and anything that knows only how to take will, sooner or later, be left with nothing. Back home in Skelvik, they were greeted by smoke rising above the rooftops and the cry of Ingrid from the watchtower. She had come to visit. And the hearth of the Halson and Vorn clans burned with a steady, strong flame, set for 24 seats, and all the seats were taken, as it would always be. Because now there were those to keep it alive, and now there were many of them. Over the course of 3 days, Lord Eskel witnessed the true power of Skelvik, listened to the pact of the chain, and the responses of Eirik, Idis, and Torvald, and, following a speech by the former skeptic Bjorn, sat down by the fire himself, where he received the gift of a judge. Afterward, he took the pact away, sealed with a seal, and secured a royal charter granting the Free North Alliance with the disciples and the Tale of the Black Winter for the library. Eirik and Idis were married. The Vornies returned home. The village of Skeggi was rebuilt and its hearth healed. The disciples and young guardians dispersed throughout the chain, and Vorulf, on watch, reported that the master sleeps deeply and the chain holds. The story is complete, and all plot lines have been resolved. The doomed village has become the heart of the living North, and the mystery of the Hearth System has been revealed. The warmth given to others does not diminish, but multiplies, and no cold can overcome it, for cold knows only how to take.